Do you really think that I would do that to you, Richard? No, I guess you wouldn't do such a thing. But why would Zed? He loves me. He is also terrified for you, terrified that you are being taken over by this delusion or bewitchment or whatever is causing this sickness that is leaving you alive but not really yourself, turning you into a stranger they don't know. Zed feels that this might be their only chance to ever have you whole again, to ever have you be Richard, the real Richard, again. I don't think that any of them, Anne, Nathan, or Zed, really wants to do this, but Anne truly believes that you alone are the salvation for our cause. She has faith that prophecy has revealed this as the only chance we have, and she is desperate to make you well, lest we all be lost. Zed was reluctant, but then they showed him a message in the journey book and talked him into it. What message? Verna is with the Daharan troops. She sent word that our soldiers are becoming disheartened that you haven't joined them. Verna fears that unless you are there to lead them, they may choose not to go on. She sent a desperate message wanting to know if Anne had found you yet, trying to find out when you could be expected to join your men in the coming battle with the Imperial Order. Richard was stunned. I suppose I can understand why the three of them are so worried, but to ask you to use subtractive magic... I know. I think it's a solution born of desperation, not clear thinking. But worse, I fear that once they discover that I don't intend to do as they wanted, they will then decide that they can't let this opportunity slip away from them, and so their only alternative will be to try to somehow use their gift to cure you themselves. That kind of blind tampering with consciousness would be unpredictable, to say the least. They're desperate because they fear we all are running out of time before Jagang ends our chances forever. They believe this is the only solution. They are no longer listening to reason. You have to get out of here, now, Richard. I only agreed to their plan so that I could warn you first and give you time to get away. You must leave immediately if you are to escape. Richard's head was spinning at the very notion of what they wanted to do. That presents a problem. I don't know how to cover my trail with magic the way Zed can. If they are as committed as you say they are, then they will come after me. If they follow me and take me by surprise, what am I going to do then? Fight them? She lifted her arms in frustration. I don't know, Richard, but I do know their state of resolve. Nothing you say is going to talk them out of this because they think you are suffering under a condition where you aren't rational. So they feel that for your own good they must take control. They may be doing it for loving reasons, but they're wrong to do it this way. Dear spirits, I too think you're suffering from some problem, but I just couldn't allow them to do this. Richard squeezed her shoulder in a gesture of appreciation before he turned away as he tried to take it all in. It was near to impossible for him to imagine that Zed would agree to such a thing. It just wasn't like him. Wasn't like him. Of course. It also wasn't like Anne to be so certain of how Richard must be made to play out his role in prophecy. Kaelin had changed everyone who knew her. She had made Anne come to see how Richard wasn't meant to follow the literal reading of prophecy, as if it were a book of instruction. Since Kaelin had vanished, everyone had changed. Zed was different too, and not in ways that were at all helpful. Even Kara had changed. She was just as protective, but now she was protective in a somehow more feminine way. Nietzsche had changed as well, although in her case, Richard thought the results were more positive, from his standpoint anyway. She had forgotten everything having to do with Kaelin, and as a result, she had become more sheltering of him despite her own views and interests, more willing to champion him despite everything he said and did. She was more devoted to him, and thus more dedicated to safeguarding him. But Zed had changed in ways that were more troubling, much as Anne had become more overbearing and willing to directly interfere with Richard's decisions and impose her views of what she believed Richard had to do. Richard had been telling people all along that the implications of Kaelin's disappearance were far broader and more complex than anyone but he was seeing. This change in everyone's behavior, some subtle and some overt, was further manifestation of those far-reaching effects. And yet, even Richard hadn't realized the full extent of the hidden corollaries and consequences. Things had changed. Richard could no longer allow past characteristics to confuse the reality of how matters were in the present. It was vital that he recognize the truth of the way things were now and not be influenced by how they had once been. Nietzsche had become even more of an ally. Kara was just as protective as ever, if in a subtly different way, but Zed and Anne and possibly Nathan had become less than dependable in ways that mattered most. He had to take the way people had changed into account and act accordingly. He had to keep his objectives in mind and act to accomplish those goals even if it meant no longer fully trusting people he once had, people he cared about. With Kalen's disappearance, everything was being altered. The rules had changed. He turned back to Nietzsche. This couldn't have happened at a worse time. I just figured it out. The Viper with 4 heads are the Sisters of the Dark. Jagang sisters? No, my former teachers. Sisters Tovi, Cecilia, Armina, and their leader, Sister Ulyssia. Sister Ulyssia was the one who assigned all of my teachers, including you. Richard, that's just crazy. I don't... No, it's not. That morning when I thought I saw the tree limbs moving when there was no wind, it wasn't the tree limbs. It was those sisters I saw move about in the near darkness. But Chagang has all the Sisters of the Dark. No, he doesn't. He's a dream walker, Richard. With the bond to you, the Sisters of the Light who are free are out of his grasp. But he captured those sisters. I was there with them when Chagang first got his clutches on us. They are Sisters of the Dark. Without the bond, they're helpless against the Dreamwalker. My feelings are what bonded me to you and allowed me to escape his control. But they couldn't escape. They're not loyal to you, nor could they be. Oh, but they are. They swore a bond to me. What? That's impossible. Richard shook his head. You weren't with them the day it happened. It was when Jagang's troops were trying to take the Palace of the Prophets. Sister Ulyssia and my former teachers, except you were gone and Liliana was dead, knew where Kalen was being held. They wanted free of Jagang's domination, and so they made me an offer. They traded the whereabouts of Kalen in exchange for being allowed to swear loyalty to me so they could escape the Dreamwalker's domination. Nietzsche was in near apoplexy with bottled objections. She looked as if the idea was so bizarre that she had trouble even deciding where to start. She heaved a breath to gain control of her galloping objections. Richard, you simply have to stop coming up with such flights of fancy. None of this even works in your story. The Viper, as you think you figured out, would really then have to have 5 heads. You forgot Marissa. No, Marissa is dead. She was trying to kill me. She came after me. She said she intended to bathe in my blood. Nietzsche pulled a strand of hair through her finger and thumb. Well, I admit I often heard her make that vow. She tried to make good on the vow. She had followed Kalen and me in the Sliff. The Sword of Truth is incompatible with life in the Sliff. When I got here, I retrieved the sword and plunged it into the Sliff before Marissa was able to get out. She died in there. Of those Sisters of the Dark who swore loyalty to me, only 4 are still alive. Those sisters are the Viper with 4 heads. They're the ones who came that morning and took Kalen. They used magic to spell me so that I wouldn't awake easily. The spell they used must have been something simple, like magnifying my sleepiness so that I wouldn't realize that magic had been used on me. The single wolf that called wasn't a wolf, but a signal given by the approaching troops. Because of the spell, I didn't recognize it for what it was. The spell made me so sleepy I couldn't think, but still I knew there was something strange about it. The sisters then used magic to cover their trail. They took Kalen. Nietzsche seized fists full of blonde hair as she growled in agitation. But they're Sisters of the Dark. They can't be bonded to you and the Keeper both. That whole concept is crazy. I thought so, too. Sister Ulyssia convinced me that I was only looking at it from my perspective. She wanted to swear loyalty, and in return I got to ask where Kaelin was. They had to answer truthfully to honor their bond. They then were to leave. If I asked any more than that, it would break our agreement, and we would all be back where we started, them subjects of Jagang and Kaelin a captive. Sister Ulyssia said that after swearing their bond to me and my asking one question, they would then leave. They got the bond, I got Kaelin.
But they're sisters of the dark.
Sister Ulyssia said that if they didn't actively try to kill me thereafter, they considered that to definitely be to my benefit, so that was, in their view, conforming to the requirements of their bond, since not killing me was what I wanted, therefore keeping their bond to me intact. Nietzsche turned away, one hand on a hip. In an odd sort of way, that actually makes sense. Sister Ulyssia is more than devious. That's the way she thinks. Nietzsche turned back.
What am I saying? Now you're starting to suck me into your delusions. Richard, stop this. Look, you have to get out of here, and you have to do it now. Come on, Kara will be right behind me with your things.
Richard knew that Nietzsche was right. He couldn't find Kaelin if he had to worry about warding off 3 people with the gift who knew quite well how to use it and wanted to alter his very thoughts. They weren't likely to give him any chance to explain anything. He had already tried explanations, and that hadn't worked. They would most likely do what they thought they had to do. Richard didn't believe that they would give him any warning. Before he knew what had hit him, it would be over. He hated to admit it to himself, but he knew that Zed was capable of such a thing. After giving Richard the Sword of Truth, when they were on their way to try to recover the boxes of Orden that Darkenral had put into play, Zed had once said that so many lives were at stake that he would not hesitate to kill even Richard if necessary to save all those innocent people. He had told Richard how to be the Seeker and carry the Sword of Truth. He had to be ready to be just as committed to their cause, that he had to understand the larger picture. It was hardly out of the question to imagine Zed now being willing to use magic to try to erase Richard's memory of Kaelin, a memory that Zed thought was a sickness that was harming him and their cause, and thereby endangering the lives of millions. "I think you're right," Richard admitted in a dejected voice. "They will try to stop me." He picked up the 2 small books lying on the table and slipped them into a back pocket. "I think we had better get out of here before they can do that."
We? You want me to go with you?
Richard paused and shrugged self-consciously. "Nietzsche, you and Kara are the only true friends I have right now. You've been there to help me when I needed it most. I can't afford to leave valued friends behind just when I'm beginning to figure out what's going on. Once I do have it figured out, I may need your help with it. But even if I don't, I'd like you there with me just for the advice and support you give me. I mean, if you're willing to come. I'd not force you, of course, but I'd like you to come." Nietzsche smiled that rare smile she had, the smile that revealed the nobility of the woman Nietzsche really was, the smile he had only seen since she had come to love life. Chapter 59. Kara stood impatiently waiting on the other side of the shield. Rika, standing guard near the iron door, was watching out into the tower room. Both turned when they saw the red glow and heard Richard coming. He saw packs and other gear collected into a neat pile just inside the door. He pulled his pack out from among the others and stuffed the 2 books inside. "We're leaving, then?" Kara asked. Richard put his arms through the straps and hiked the pack up onto his back. "Yes, and I think we best not waste any time." As he picked up his bow and quiver, everyone else started gathering their own things. It appeared that Kara, wanting Nietzsche to be near Richard so that she would be handy to help protect him, had brought the sorceress's things along as well. Richard wondered how much of wanting Nietzsche along had to do with what Shota had said. He saw that Rika, too, had a pack. He almost asked her what she thought she was doing, but realized then that she was Mord Sith, and she would say that her place was with him.
He had spent so much time with only Kara protecting him that he thought it would feel a bit odd having more than one Mord Sith around again. "Everyone ready?" he asked, as he saw them all tightening straps and buckles. After each woman nodded, Richard led the grim-faced group out the doorway. He knew that Kara might have followed him without a question, but she wouldn't blindly follow Nietzsche or anyone else's orders without good reason, so he suspected that Kara had probably asked a lot of pointed questions, something Mord Sith were wont to do, and found out why they had to leave. Page 597. At the base of the tower, Richard ran his hand along the iron railing as he started around the walkway, but then a sudden realization brought him to a halt. Everyone waited, watching him, wondering why he had stopped. Richard looked at Nietzsche's puzzled blue eyes. "They're not going to trust you in this." "What do you mean?" Nietzsche asked. "It's too important. They aren't going to leave it to you to do as they instructed. They will be concerned that you'll lose your courage or that you might fail and allow me to slip away." Kara stepped closer. "You mean you think they will come looking for you?" "No, not looking for me," Richard said, "but I bet that somewhere between here and the way out of the keep they will be lying in wait, just in case I get past Nietzsche and try to leave. If we come upon them unexpectedly, then it will be too late." "Lord Ral," Rika said, "Mistress Kara and I would not allow anyone to harm you." Richard lifted an eyebrow. "I'd just as soon not have it come to that. Those three think they need to help me. They aren't intent on harming me, at least not intentionally. I don't want you two to hurt them." "But if they surprise us with the intent of using their magic on you, you can't expect us to let them do it," Kara said. Richard met her gaze for a moment. "Like I said, I don't want it to come to that." "Lord Ral," Kara said in a low voice, "I simply can't allow anyone to attack you in such a way, even if they think it's to help you. You can't equivocate in a situation like that. If they attack you, it must be stopped, period. If they were allowed to succeed, then you would never be the same again. You would no longer be the Lord Ral we know, the Lord Ral you are." Kara leaned even closer and fixed him with that look that Mord Sith had that always made him sweat. "If they do attack you and are allowed to succeed because you fear to harm them, then when they are finished you will no longer remember this woman, Kaelin. Is that what you want?" Richard clenched his jaw as he let out a deep breath. "No, it's not. Let's try to avoid having it come to such things, but if it does, then I guess you're right. They can't be allowed to do as they intend. But if we must stop them, let's not use any more force than necessary." "Hesitation is a mistake that invites defeat," Kara said. "I would not be Mord Sith had I not hesitated when I was young." Richard knew she was right. The sword of truth had taught him that much at least. The dance with death allowed no compromise between life and death. He laid a hand on Kara's shoulder. "I understand." Nietzsche gazed up the tower, her blue eyes taking in the doors all around it. "Where do you think they will wait?" "I don't know," Richard said as he hooked his thumbs under the shoulder straps of his pack. "The wizard's keep is immense, but in the end, there's only one way out. Since there are so many routes we could take, I'd guess it will be when we get nearer the courtyard, out to the portcullis." "Lord Ral," Rika spoke up, looking a little uneasy once he met her gaze. "There is another way out." Richard frowned at her. "What are you talking about?" "There is another way out besides the main entrance. It is only accessible through passages deep in the keep." "How do you know such a thing?" "Your grandfather showed it to me." Richard didn't have time to wonder at such a thing. "Do you think you can find it again?" Rika considered a moment. "I believe so," she finally said. "I sure wouldn't want to get us lost down in the keep, but I believe I can find a way. Starting out from here, we're already part of the way, so it won't be quite so hard." Richard went to rest his hand on the hilt of his sword as he considered.
The sword wasn't there. He rubbed his palms together instead. Maybe it would be better if we went that way. Rika turned, her blonde braid whipping around as she did so, and started away. Follow me, then. Richard let Nietzsche go ahead of him, then followed, letting Kara bring up the rear. He hadn't gone a dozen steps when he stopped. He turned and looked back. Everyone glanced to where he was looking and then watched him, puzzled by what he could be thinking. We can't go that way either. He turned back to Rika. Zed showed you that way out of the keep. He knows Mord Sith. He knows that despite how well you two got along, if presented with a choice, your loyalties will fall to me. Zed is fond of using tricks. He will let Anne and Nathan guard the routes to the main entrance to the keep. He will lie in wait on the route he showed you, Rika. Well, if there are only two ways out, Nietzsche said, that means they will have to split up to make sure both are blocked. That's if Zed goes through the thought process as you've laid it out. He might forget that he told Rika about the other way out, or he might not think that she would tell you. That way still might be clear. Richard slowly shook his head as he stared off at something else, the wide platform partway back around the walkway, around the stagnant water in the bottom of the gloomy interior of the tower. While what you say is possible, counting on Zed to make such a strategic mistake would be foolish. Nietzsche was looking a bit worried. Well, you can't use your power without chancing calling the beast, but I certainly can use mine. And I have more power at my command than Zed does. If they split up as you suggest, then we will not have all three to contend with at once. No, but I'd not like to have that kind of a test, especially not in the keep. It's possible that there are defenses here that he has initiated to protect the first wizard should he be attacked. You might simply try to catch him up in a conjured tangle to slow him down while we escape, and it might be all it takes to trigger something lethal. Besides, even if you do manage to succeed at such a thing, he could still come after us. Nietzsche folded her arms. Then what exactly do you suggest we do? He turned back and once again met her blue eyes. I suggest that we take a way out that they can't follow. Her nose wrinkled up. What? The Sliff. Everyone looked back down the walkway as if the Sliff might be standing there waiting for them to come and travel with her. Of course, Kara said. We could escape without them ever knowing where we've gone. There will be no tracks. More than that, though, it can put us a tremendous distance away from the danger. They will have no hope of ever following us. Exactly. Richard clapped her on the back of the shoulder. Let's go. They all followed him as he rushed down the walkway and through the blasted open doorway. Inside the Sliff's room, Nietzsche cast magic, igniting the torches in brackets on the walls as they gathered around the well. Everyone peered down together. There's only one problem, Richard said out loud as the thought came to him while gazing down into the black abyss. He looked up at Nietzsche. I have to use magic to call the Sliff. Nietzsche took a deep breath and let it out with a discouraged look. That is a problem. Not necessarily, Kara said. Shota told us that using your magic had the potential to call the blood beast, but it acts randomly. When you use magic, it would be logical that it would thus find you, but the beast doesn't act through logic. It might come when you use magic, Shota said, or it might not. There's no way to tell or predict. And we're pretty certain that we're not going to be able to walk out of this place without having to confront the others, Nietzsche pointed out. Trying to run will present two problems, Richard said. Getting past them, and then keeping out of their grasp to prevent them from trying to heal me. This makes more sense. The Sliff would be a certain way to escape, without Zed, Anne, and Nathan having any way to either follow or know where I went. And it would also avoid confronting them, something I'd not like to have to do. I love my grandfather. I don't want to have to defend myself against him. I almost hate to say it, Kara said, but this makes more sense to me, too. I agree, Rika said. call the Sliff." Nietzsche held a handful of her hair back as she looked down to peer into the well again. "And hurry, before they come looking to see what's taking me so long." Richard didn't hesitate. He stretched his fists out over the well. He needed to call his own gift in order to call the Sliff, and calling his own ability was not something he was good at. He resolved that he had done it before. He would have to do it again. He let his tension go. He knew that he had to do this, or he very well might lose his chance to ever find the one woman he loved more than life itself. For a moment, the pain of how much he hurt every day without her nearly made him pull inward with the aching misery of it. With his sincere and burning need to do whatever he must in order to help Kaylin, his need ignited deep within him. He felt it roaring up from the core of his being, taking his breath. He tightened his abdominal muscles against the power of the feeling within him. Light ignited between his outstretched fists. He recognized the sensation from having done it before. He pressed the padded silver leather wristbands he wore together. He had not had these the first time, but they were what the Sliff had told him he should use to call her again. They brightened to such intensity that through his flesh and bone Richard could see the other side of the heavy silver bands. He focused his intent. He wanted nothing else but for the Sliff to come to him so that he could help Kaylin. He hungered for it. He demanded it be done. "Come to me." The glow of light wailed as it ignited in a line down the center of the well like a lightning bolt, but instead of the sound of thunder, the air crackled with the ripping roar of fire and light racing away at incredible speed into the depths of blackness. Those around the stone wall gazed anxiously down inside the well, lit by the flash of light. Nietzsche also glanced around, keeping an eye on the room around them, apparently worried about the appearance of the beast. The echo of the power Richard had sent down into the well was a long time in fading away, but at last all fell silent. In the stillness of the keep, in the quiet of the mountain of dead stone towering around and above them, came a distant, deep rumbling, a rumbling of something coming to life. The floor began to quake with growing force until it began lifting dust from the joints and cracks. Small pebbles danced on the trembling stone floor. Far down in the distant depths, the well began filling with something rushing up the shaft at impossible speed, roaring with a howling shriek of velocity as it came. The howl grew as the Sliff rushed upward to meet the call. Nietzsche, Kara, and Rika backed away from the well as shimmering silver shot upward, coming to an instantaneous stop that somehow seemed graceful. Within the undulating silver pool, a lustrous metallic hump mounded up, rising above the edge of the stone wall surrounding the well. It drew up into a bulk, rising of its own accord, gathering into a recognizable shape. Its glossy surface, like a liquid mirror, reflected everything around the room, distorting the images reflected off its surface as it grew and transformed. It looked like living quicksilver. The rising shape continued to contort, bending into edges and planes, folds and curves, until it warped into a woman's face. A silver smile widened in what seemed to be recognition. "Master, you called me?" The Sliff's eerie feminine voice echoed around the room, but her lips hadn't moved. Richard stepped closer, ignoring Nietzsche and Rika's wide-eyed astonishment. "Yes. Sliff, thank you for coming. I need you." A silver smile was pleased. "You wish to travel, Master?" "Yes, I wish to travel. We all do. We all need to travel." The smile widened. "Come, then. We will travel." Richard herded everyone close to the wall. Liquid metal formed into a hand that reached out to touch each of the three women in turn.
You have traveled before, the Sliff said to Kara after only brief contact with her forehead. You may travel. The glistening hand gently brushed a palm across Nietzsche's brow, lingering for a bit longer. You have what is required. You may travel. Rika lifted her chin, ignoring her distaste for magic, and stood her ground as the Sliff touched her forehead. You may not travel, the Sliff said. Rika looked indignant. But if Kara can, why can't I? You do not have both sides required, said the voice. Rika folded her arms defiantly. I must go with them. I'm going too. That's all there is to it. It is your choice. But if you try to travel in me, you will die, and then you will not be with them either. Richard laid a hand on Rika's arm before she could say anything else. Kara captured the power of someone who had an element of the required magic. That's why she can travel. There is nothing to be done about it. You have to stay here. Rika didn't look at all happy, but she nodded. The rest of you had better get going then. Come, the Sliff said to Richard, and we will travel. To which place do you wish to travel? Richard almost said it aloud, but then stopped himself. He turned to Rika. You can't come with us. I think you had better leave now, so that you don't even hear where I'm going. I don't want to take the chance that if you know, then the others might somehow find out. My grandfather can be clever when he wants to be, and pull tricks to get his way. You don't need to tell me, Rika sighed in resignation. You're probably right, Lord Rahl. She smiled at Kara. Protect him. Kara nodded. I always do. He's pretty helpless without me. Richard ignored Kara's boast. Rika, I need you to tell Zed something for me. I need you to give him a message. Rika frowned as she listened intently. Tell him that 4 Sisters of the Dark have captured Kalen, the real Mother Confessor, not the body buried down in Aidendrill. Tell him that I intend to come back as soon as I can, and I will bring him the proof. I ask that when I return, before he tries to cure me, he allow me to show him the evidence I bring, and tell him that I love him and understand his concern for me, but that I'm doing as the Seeker must do, as he himself charged me to do when he gave me the Sword of Truth. When Rika had gone, Kara asked, What evidence? I don't know. I haven't found it yet. Richard turned to Nietzsche. Don't forget what I told you before. You have to breathe in the Sliff once we go under. At first you'll want to hold your breath, but that just isn't possible. Once we arrive and come up out of the Sliff, you must let her out of your lungs and again breathe in the air. Nietzsche was looking more than a little nervous. Richard took her hand. I'll be with you, as will Kara. We've both done this before. I won't let go of you. It's hard to make yourself breathe in the Sliff for the first time, but once you do, you will see that it's quite a remarkable experience. It's rapture to breathe the Sliff. Rapture, Nietzsche repeated, with more than just a little incredulity. Lord Rahl is right, Kara said. You'll see. Just remember, Richard added, when it ends, you will not want to let go of the Sliff and breathe air again, but you must. If you don't, you'll die. Do you understand? Of course, Nietzsche said with a nod. Come on, then. Richard started to climb up on the wall, pulling Nietzsche up with him. Where will we travel, Master? I think we should go to the People's Palace in Dahara. Do you know the place? Of course. The People's Palace is a central site. A central site? If living Quicksilver could be said to look puzzled by a question, the Sliff looked puzzled. Yes, a central site. Like this place here is a central site. Richard didn't understand, but didn't think it was relevant, and so didn't press the issue. I see. Why the People's Palace? Nietzsche asked. Richard shrugged. We have to go somewhere. We'll be safe at the palace. But more importantly, they have libraries there with rare ancient books.
I'm hoping that maybe we can find something about Chainfire. Since the sisters have Kalen, I'm thinking that Chainfire might have something to do with some kind of magic. From what we've heard, the Daharan army is somewhere in the vicinity on their way south. What's more, the last time I saw Berdine, another Mord Sith, was when I left her here in Aidendrill, so she will probably be either close to our troops or the palace. I need her to help me translate some of the material from the books I'm bringing along. Besides that, she has Kolo's journal, and she may already know something helpful. He glanced at Kara. Maybe we can see General Meifert and see how things are going with the troops. Kara's face lit with surprise and a broad grin. Nietzsche nodded thoughtfully. I guess all that makes sense, and I guess it's as good a place as any. It gets you out of immediate danger, and that's what matters most right now. All right, Sliff, Richard said. We wish to travel to the People's Palace in Dahara. A liquid silver arm came up and slipped around all three of them. Richard felt the warm, undulating grip compressing to get a firm grasp on him. Nietzsche had his hand in a death grip. Lord Rahl? Kara asked. Richard held up the hand that wasn't holding Nietzsche's to halt the Sliff before she could lift them into the well. What? Kara bit her lip before finally speaking. You're holding Nietzsche's hand. Will you hold my hand too? I mean, I wouldn't want the three of us to get separated. Richard tried not to smile at the worry on her face. Kara feared magic, even if she had already done this before. Sure, Richard said as he took her hand. I wouldn't want us to get separated. A sudden thought struck him. Wait, he said, stopping the Sliff before she could start. Yes, Master? Do you know a person named Kalen? Kalen Amnel, the Mother Confessor? This name means nothing to me. Richard sighed in disappointment. He hadn't really expected the Sliff to know Kalen. No one else did either. Would you happen to know a place called the Deep Nothing? I know several places in the Deep Nothing. Some have been destroyed, but some still exist. I can travel to them if you wish. Richard's heart quickened in surprise. Are any of these places in the Deep Nothing also a central site? Yes, one of them, the Sliff said. Casca, in the Deep Nothing, is a central site. Would you like to travel there? Richard glanced at both Nietzsche and Kara. Do either of you know this place, Casca? Nietzsche shook her head. Kara was frowning. I think I remember hearing something about it when I was little. I'm sorry, Lord Rahl, but I don't remember exactly what. Just that the name sounds familiar from old legends. What do you mean, legends? Kara shrugged. Old Daharan legends. Something about dreamcasters. Stories people told. Something about the history of Dahara. It seems like Casca is a name from olden times. Olden times. Dreamcasters. Richard remembered that when he'd skimmed through some of the book Gegendraus that he'd found back in the shielded room, he had seen something about casting dreams, but he hadn't translated the passage. Even though Richard was the leader of the Daharan Empire, he knew very little about the mysterious Dahara. Even if Kara didn't know more, Richard still felt as if he had just taken a step closer to finding Kara. We wish to travel, he said to the Sliff. We wish to travel to Casca, in the Deep Nothing. It had been a long time since Richard had traveled in the Sliff, and he felt a bit apprehensive, but his excitement that he was finally making connections to find the answers that had for so long eluded him swept away any concern. We travel to Casca, then, the Sliff said, her voice echoing around the stone room where once Kolo had died, standing guard over her as the Great War had come to an end. At least everyone thought it had come to an end, but those ancient conflicts had not ended so easily, and now they had again flared to life. The arm lifted all three of them off the wall and plunged them down into the silver froth. Nietzsche's grip on his hand tightened, and she gasped in a breath before going under. Chapter 60. With an arrow's speed, Richard flew through the silken silence of the Sliff, yet at the same time he glided with the slow grace of a raven riding the stilled currents above towering trees on a moonlit night. There was no heat, no cold. In the silence, sweet sounds filled his mind. His eyes beheld light and dark together in a single spectral vision, while his lungs swelled with the sweet presence of the Sliff as he breathed her into his soul. It was rapture. Abruptly, it ended. Grainy darkness exploded in his sudden vision. There seemed to be blocky shapes all around as he broke the surface. Nietzsche's hand gripped his in terror. "Breathe," the Sliff told him. Richard let out the sweet breath, emptying his lungs of the rapture. With a needful gasp, he sucked in the alien air. Kara, too, gasped in the hot, dusty air. Nietzsche floated face down, rocking gently in the silver fluid. Richard threw an arm over the stone wall at the side of the Sliff, pulling Nietzsche with him. He took his bow off his back to get it out of his way, and quickly set it against the outside of the wall. With the Sliff's help, he hopped up on the wall, and then, with the Sliff lifting her, pulled the dead weight of Nietzsche up enough to get her shoulders and head up into the warm, dark air. Richard slapped her on the back. "Breathe, Nietzsche. Breathe. Come on, you have to let go of the Sliff and breathe. Do it for me." At last she did. She gasped in the air, her arms flailing in terror at being confused and lost in such strange surroundings. Richard pulled her close as he helped her get her arms over the side and, panting, climb up on the wall. Brackets on the walls nearby held glass spheres, like back at the keep, that glowed brighter as he climbed out of the well. "What do you think this place is?" Kara asked as she peered around in the dim light. "That was rapture," Nietzsche said, still under the sway of the experience. "I told you," Richard said as he helped her climb out. "It looks like we're in a stone room of some kind," Kara said as she walked around the perimeter of the room. Richard made his way toward the darkness at one end, and two larger spheres in tall iron brackets brightened with an eerie green glow. He saw that they flanked steps. The steps, though, marched up to the ceiling. "That's pretty strange," Kara said as she stood on the second step inspecting the dark ceiling. "Here," Nietzsche said. She was leaning over to the side of the steps. "There's a metal plate." It was the kind of metal plate Richard had seen in other places. They were trigger plates for shields. Nietzsche tapped her palm against it, but nothing happened. Richard pressed his hand to the icy cold plate, and stone started grating as it moved. Dust came down in streamers. The three of them ducked back as they all peered around in the gloomy light, trying to figure out what exactly was moving. The ground trembled. It felt like the whole room might be shifting and somehow changing shape. Richard then realized that it was actually the ceiling that was pulling aside. A growing patch of moonlight fell across the steps. Richard had no idea where they were other than down in a stone room that appeared to be buried. He didn't know where Casca was, other than the Sliff said that it was in the deep nothing, and he didn't know where that was, so he didn't really know what to expect. He felt decidedly uneasy. He reached for his sword. The sword wasn't there. For what felt like the 1,000th time, he felt the sinking regret of realizing why and where it now was. He drew his long knife instead as he started up the steps in a crouch, ducking low, not only so as not to hit his head on the ceiling before it had moved out of the way, but out of caution for who might be outside and have heard stones sliding aside. Kara, seeing him draw his knife, spun her aegil up into her fist. She tried to get out ahead of him, but he held his arm out, keeping her behind to the left.
Nietzsche was close behind to his right. As he came up out of the ground, he saw the shadowed shapes of 3 people standing not far ahead. He knew that from being in the sliff, until he fully recovered, his vision was more acute than ordinary. He could probably see them better than they could see him. With that sharp vision, Richard saw that the big man in the middle was holding a slender girl back against him. He had one hand over her mouth. He could see the girl squirming. Moonlight gleamed off the blade he held to her throat. "Drop your weapons," the man holding the girl growled, "and surrender to the Imperial Order, or you will die." Richard flipped the knife into the air, let it make a half-turn, and caught it by the tip. An inky shape suddenly swooped atop the man's head. The bird let out a piercing caw. The man flinched. Richard didn't take the time to wonder at such an unexpected assault. He heaved the knife. On broad wings, the bird lifted into the air. The blade hit the man in the center of his face with a solid thunk. Richard knew that the blade was long enough to have penetrated all the way through the man's brain, and that the tip would have pierced the back of the skull. The man dropped straight down behind the trembling girl, dead before he could think to do her harm. Before the men to either side of the girl could take a half a step, Nietzsche unleashed a scything whisper of power that took the heads off the other 2 men. The only noise it made was the sound of the heads hitting the ground with twin dull thuds. The bodies toppled to either side of the girl. The night was still, but for the drone of cicadas. The girl hesitantly stepped closer and dropped to her knees. She bent forward before the steps until her forehead touched the stone at his feet. "Lord Ral, I am your humble servant. Thank you for coming and protecting me. I live only to serve. My life is yours. Command me as you will." Even as the girl was still speaking in a quavering voice, Kara and Nietzsche were spreading out to the sides, searching for other threats. Richard crossed his lips with a finger to let them know to be quiet about it, so as not to alert any other troops that might be near. Both saw his signal and nodded. Richard waited, listening for any threat. Since the girl was on the ground, he let her stay there, out of harm's way. He heard the whisper of feathers against air as the raven landed on a nearby limb, and then the soft rustle as it folded in its wings. "It's clear," Nietzsche announced in a quiet voice as she returned from the shadows. "My Hahn tells me there are no others in the immediate vicinity." Relieved, Richard let the tension go out of his muscles. When he heard the girl weeping in quiet terror, he sat down on the top step right near her. He suspected her terror was fear that she might be killed just as the 3 men had been. Richard wanted to assure her that she was not going to die. "It's all right," he told her, as he gently grasped her shoulders and urged her up. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." As she came up, he gathered the frightened girl into his arms, embracing her protectively, holding her head to his shoulder when she glanced to the 3 dead men as if they still might jump up and snatch her away. She was a slender, lithesome creature, the kind of girl on the brink of being a woman, yet looking as frail as a bird about to leave the nest. Her slender arms came gratefully around Richard as she wept with relief. "The bird a friend of yours?" he asked. "Loki," she confirmed with a nod. "He watches over me." "Well, he did a good job tonight." "I thought you weren't going to come, Master Ra. I thought it was my fault, that I wasn't a good enough priestess for you." Richard ran a hand down the back of her head. "How did you know I was coming here?" "The tellings say it is so, but I already waited so long that I thought they might be wrong. I was near to despairing that you would find us not worthy, and then I feared it was my failing." He surmised that the tellings must mean prophecy of some sort. "You are a priestess, you say?" She nodded as she pulled back to look up at his smile. Richard saw then that her big, copper-colored eyes peered out from a dark mask painted in a band around her face.
It was a disturbing visage.
I am the priestess of the bones. You have returned to help me. I am your servant. I am the one meant to cast the dreams.
Returned?
To life. You have come back from the dead.
Richard could only stare. Nietzsche squatted down beside the girl.
What do you mean he returned from the dead?
The girl pointed behind them at the structure from where they had emerged.
From the world of the dead, back to we the living. It says his name there on his tomb.
Richard turned and indeed did see his name carved in the monument. The thing that came immediately to mind was seeing Kalen's name carved in stone, too. Both of them were alive, despite their graves. The girl glanced at Kara and then at Nietzsche.
The tellings say that you will come back to life, Lord Rahl, but they did not say that you would bring your spirit familiars.
I haven't come back from the dead, Richard told her. I came through the sliff, down there in that well.
She nodded. The well of the dead. The tellings mention such mysterious things, but I never knew their meaning.
Do I call you priestess or by your name?
You are Master Rahl. You can call me as it pleases you. My name is Jillian, though. I have had that name my whole life. I'm afraid I have not been a priestess a long time, and so I'm not very good at it, I don't think. My grandfather said that when it is time, it matters not how old I am, but that it is time.
How about if I call you Jillian, then? He asked with a smile. She appeared still too frightened to return the smile.
I would like that, Master Rahl.
My name is Richard. I'd like it if you called me Richard. She nodded, still with that look of awe filling her round eyes. Richard didn't know if her awe was at the Master Rahl or a dead man returned to life and walking up out of his grave. Now look, Jillian, I don't know anything about your tellings yet, but you need to understand that I haven't returned from the dead. I traveled here because I have trouble, and I'm looking for answers.
You have found the trouble, then. You killed 3 of them. The answer is for you to help me cast the dreams so that we might drive these evil men away. They have driven most of my people into hiding. The older ones are down there. She pointed down the dark slope. They tremble in fear that these men will kill them if they do not find what they seek.
What are they looking for? Richard asked.
I'm not sure. I have been hiding among the spirits of our ancestors. The men must have made someone down there tell them of me, because they knew my name when they finally chased me down today. I have been staying out of their grasp for a long time. Today, they were hiding where I had cached some food. The men grabbed me and wanted me to show them where the books are.
These aren't the regular Imperial Order troops, Nietzsche explained to the frowning look on his face. They're advanced scouts. Richard glanced at the bodies. How do you know?
Because regular Imperial Order troops would never ask you to put down your weapons and surrender. Only the scouts, searching routes through strange lands and hunting for any information they can uncover, would take prisoners. They question people. Those who won't talk are sent back to be tortured. These scouts are the men who first find stashes of books that are then collected for the Emperor to see. Scouts like this find not only the best routes for the troops, but they are meant to find something even more important for the Emperor, knowledge, especially that in books. Richard knew the truth of that. Jagang seemed to be an expert on history and what had been done in ancient times. He used that information to great advantage. It seemed like Richard was always trying to catch up with what Jagang already knew. Have these men found any of the books yet? Richard asked Jillian. Her copper-colored eyes blinked. My grandfather has told me about books, but I know of none that are here. The city has been abandoned since ancient times. If there were books, they have long ago been looted, along with anything else of value. That was not what Richard had hoped to hear. He had been hoping that maybe there would be something here that would help answer the question he had. After all, Shota had told him that he must find the place of the bones in the deep nothing. The graveyard all around him certainly was a place of bones. "This place is called the deep nothing?" he asked her. Jillian nodded. "It is a vast land where little lives. None but my people can scrape a life from this forbidding place. People have always feared to come here. The bleached bones of those who do venture here are out there, in this place and to the south before the Great Barrier. The land is called the Deep Nothing." Richard realized that it must be a place much like the wilds in the Midlands. "The Great Barrier?" Kara asked suspiciously. Jillian looked up at the moored Sith. "The Great Barrier that protects us from the old world." "This has to be southern Dahara," Kara told him. "That's why I heard stories about Casca when I was a child, because it's in Dahara." Jillian pointed. "This is the place of my ancestors. They were destroyed by those from the old world back in ancient times. They, too, were ones who cast dreams." She looked off into the darkness to the south, but they failed and were destroyed. Richard didn't have time to try to figure it all out. He had enough problems. "Have you ever heard of Chainfire?" Jillian frowned. "No. What is Chainfire?" "I don't know." He tapped a finger against his bottom lip as he thought about what to do next. "Richard," Jillian said, "you must help me cast the dreams that will drive these men away so that my people will be safe again." Richard glanced up at Nietzsche. "Any ideas how I can do such a thing?" "No," she said, "but I can tell you that the rest of the men will sooner or later come looking for these 3 dead men. These aren't your average Imperial Order soldiers. They may be brutes, but they are the smartest of them. I imagine that casting dreams is something that involves your gift. Not an advisable thing to be doing," she added. Richard stood up and put one hand on a hip as he stared off at the dark city on the headland. "Seek what is long buried," he whispered to himself. He turned back to Jillian. "You said that you were a priestess of the bones. I need you to show me everything you know about the bones." Jillian shook her head. "First, you must help me cast the dreams, so that I can chase the strangers away, and my grandfather and the rest of our people will be safe." Richard sighed in frustration. "Look, Jillian, I don't know how to help you cast dreams, and I don't have time to figure it out. But I would imagine, as Nietzsche said, that it involves magic. And I can't use magic, or it very well could call a beast that could kill all of your people. This beast has already killed a lot of my friends who were with me. I need you to show me what you know about what is long buried." Jillian wiped at her tears. "Those men have my grandfather and others down there. They will kill him. You must save my grandfather first. Besides, he is a teller. He knows more than me." Richard put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He could not imagine how he would feel if someone whom he thought was powerful refused to help save his grandfather. "I have an idea," Nietzsche said. "I'm a sorceress, Jillian. I know all about these men and how they work. I know how to handle them. You help Richard, and while you do that, I'll go down there and see to getting rid of these men. When I'm done, they will no longer be a danger to you or your people." "If I help Richard, you will help my grandfather?" Nietzsche smiled. "I promise." Jillian looked up at Richard. "Nietzsche keeps her word," he told her. "All right. I will show Richard everything I know about this place, while you make those men leave us be." "Kara," Richard said, "go with Nietzsche and watch her back." "And who will watch yours?" Richard put a boot on the head of the man he had killed and yanked his knife free. He pointed with the weapon. "Loki will watch our backs." Kara did not look amused. "A raven is going to watch your back?" He wiped the blade clean on the man's shirt, then returned the knife to its sheath at his belt. "The priestess of the bones will watch over me. After all, she's been here waiting all this time for me to come here. Nietzsche is the one who will be in danger. I'd appreciate it if you protected her." Kara glanced at Nietzsche as if grasping some greater meaning. "I will protect her for you, Lord Ral." Chapter 61. As Nietzsche and Kara started down toward where Jillian said the rest of the Imperial Order soldiers were, Richard went back into his tomb and recovered the smallest of the glass spheres. He slipped it into his pack so that it wouldn't interfere with his night vision, but would be handy if they had to go into any of the buildings of the city. Searching ancient decaying buildings in the dark was not a prospect he relished. Jillian was like a cat that knew every nook and cranny of the ancient city on the headland. They went through streets that had nearly disappeared under rubble and wreckage of walls long since fallen. Some of the debris had collected weather-borne dust and dirt that had eventually filled it in, making small hills where trees now grew among the buildings. There were a number of buildings Richard didn't want to enter because he could see that they were ready to collapse if the wind blew the wrong way. Others were still in relatively good condition. One of the larger buildings Jillian took him to had arches all along the front that at one time had probably held windows, or maybe had even been open to what seemed an inner courtyard. As Richard walked across the floor, small bits of crumbled mortar crunched underfoot. A mosaic made of tiny square-colored tiles covered the entire floor. The colors were long since faded, but Richard could still make them out well enough to see that the swirling lines of tiles made up a sprawling picture of trees dotting a landscape surrounded by a wall, with paths through places where there were graves. "This building is the entrance to a section of the graveyard," Jillian told him. Richard frowned as he leaned down a little, studying the picture. There was something odd about it. Moonlight fell across figures in the mosaic that were carrying platters with breads and what looked like meats into the graveyard, while other figures were coming back with empty platters. Richard straightened when he heard a horrifying cry drift up to them from the far distance. Both he and Jillian stood up stock still, listening. More of the distant, faint wails and laments drifted in on the cool night air. "What was that?" Jillian asked in a whisper, her copper-colored eyes wide. "I think Nietzsche is getting rid of the invaders. Your people will be safe once she is finished." "You mean she is hurting them?" Richard could see that such concepts were alien to the girl. "These are men who would do terrible things to your people, including your grandfather. If they are left to come back another day, they will kill your people." She turned and looked back out through the arches. "That wouldn't be good, but the dreams would have driven them away." "Did casting dreams save your ancestors? Save the people of this city?" She looked back to his eyes. "I guess not. What matters most is that people who value life, like you, your grandfather, and your people, are safe to live their lives. Sometimes that means it's necessary to eliminate those who would do you harm." She swallowed. "Yes, Lord Ral." He put a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Richard, I am a Lord Ral who wants people to be safe, to live as they wish." At last she smiled. Richard looked back to the mosaic, studying the picture. "Do you know what this means, this picture?" Finally pulling herself away from the distant, ghastly screams of pain that drifted in from the darkness, she looked down at the picture. "See this wall here?" she asked as she pointed. "The tellings say that these walls held the graves of the people of the city. This place here is where we are now. This place is the passage to the dead. The tellings say that there were always dead, but only this place to put them within the city walls. The people didn't want their loved ones to be far from them, far from what they considered the sacred place for their ancestors, so they made passages where they could find resting places for them." Shota's words echoed around in his memory. "You must find the place of the bones in the deep nothing. What you seek is long buried." "Show me this place," he told Jillian. "Take me back there."
It was more difficult to reach than he had expected it would be. There was a labyrinth of passages and rooms back through the building. Some of it went between walls that were open to the stars, only to re-enter the dark depths of the building. "This is the way of the dead," Jillian explained. "The deceased were brought in through here. It is said that it was made this way in the hopes that the souls of the dead would be confused by the passages, and these new spirits would not be able to wander back out. Instead, confined in this place and unable to come back among the living, they would then go on to be where they belonged in the spirit world." They at last came back out into the night. The crescent moon was rising above the ancient city of Casca. Loki circled above and called down to his friend. She waved back. The graveyard, spread out before him, was good-sized, but seemed inadequate for a city. Richard walked with Jillian on the path through the crowded graves. Gnarled trees stood in places. In the moonlight it was a peaceful place, with wild flowers spread across the rising and falling contour of the land. "Where are the passages you spoke of?" he asked her. "I'm sorry, Richard, but I don't know. The tellings speak of them, but do not say how to find them." Richard searched the graveyard, Jillian at his side, as the moon rose higher in the sky, and he could not find any evidence of passages. It all looked like any graveyard he had ever seen. Some of the ground was mounded with a number of markers. The stones for each grave were crowded close. Some yet stood, while others had long since fallen to lie flat on the ground or be grown over. Richard was running out of time. He couldn't stay down in Casca forever listening to the cicadas sing. This was getting him nowhere. He needed to look for answers where he was apt to find them. This ancient place did not appear to be the place. At the People's Palace in Dahara there would be valuable books that Jagang had not yet been able to loot. It was more likely that he would find useful information there than in an empty graveyard. He sat down on the side of a small hillock beneath an olive tree to consider what he might do. "Do you know of any other place where there would be these passages that were mentioned in the tellings?" Jillian's mouth twisted as she considered. "I'm sorry, but no. When it is safe, we can go down and talk to my grandfather. He knows many things, much more than me." Richard didn't know how much time he had to devote to listening to her grandfather's stories either. Loki fluttered down to the ground nearby to feast on the newly emerging cicadas. After the 17 years they'd lived underground, more of them were emerging, only to be pecked up by the raven. Richard recalled the prophecy Nathan had read to him. It had mentioned the cicadas. He wondered why. It had said something about when the cicadas awakened, the final and deciding battle was upon them. The world, it is said, was at the brink of darkness. Brink of darkness. Richard glanced down at the cicadas as they emerged. He watched them coming up out of the ground. As he watched, he realized that they were all coming up through a space in a gravestone laying face down against the rise of ground. Loki had noticed too, and stood eating them. "That's odd," he said to himself. "What's odd?" "Well, look there. The cicadas aren't coming up through the dirt. They're coming up from under that stone." Richard knelt down and pushed his fingers down into the space. It seemed hollow underneath. Loki cocked his head as he watched. Richard lifted, grunting with the effort. The stone began to lift. As it came up, he realized that it was hinged on the left. It finally gave way and opened. Richard stared down into the darkness. It wasn't a grave marker. It had been a stone cap to a passageway. He immediately pulled the glass sphere out of his pack. As it began to glow, he held it down in the dark maw. Jillian gasped. "It's a stairway." "Come on, but be careful." The stairs were stone, irregular and narrow. The leading edge of each was sway-backed and rounded from countless feet making the journey.
The passage was lined with blocks of stone, making a clear path down deep into the ground. The steps came to a landing and turned right. After another long run, they turned left and went deeper. When they finally reached the bottom, the passage opened into wider corridors that were carved from the solid but soft rock of the ground itself. Richard held the glowing globe out in one hand and Jillian's hand in his other as he bent a little to clear the low ceiling as he led them deeper. It wasn't long before they encountered an intersection. "Do your tellings say anything about finding our way down here?" She shook her head. "How about all those mazes you learned? Do you think they will do you any good down here?" "I don't know. I never knew this place existed." Richard let out a breath as he looked down each of the two passages. "All right. I'll just start going in deeper. If you think you recognize anything or any of the routes, let me know." After she agreed, they started down the left fork. To each side of the narrow passageway, they began finding niches that had been carved into the walls. Inside each lay the remains of a body. In places, the niches were stacked 3 or 5 high. Some had 2 bodies, probably a husband and wife. Around some of the recesses, ancient paintings still remained. The artwork was vines in some places, people with food in others, and in some places simple designs. From the different styles and the varying quality of the art, Richard guessed that it must have been done by loved ones for a member of their family who had died. The narrow passageway opened up into a chamber with 10 openings, tunneling off in various directions. Richard picked one and started down it. It, too, opened into broader spaces with a warren of branches. The elevation changed, from time to time going down deeper and occasionally going up a bit. They soon began encountering the bones. There were rooms with stacks of similar bones in niches. Skulls had been carefully fit into one niche, leg bones all stacked end out in another, arm bones in another yet. Great stone bins carved in the side walls held smaller bones all laid in neatly. As Richard and Jillian moved through vault after vault, they saw walls of skulls that had to number in the tens of thousands. Knowing that he was seeing only one random passageway, Richard could not imagine how many people had to be interred in the catacombs. Even as startling and even horrifying as it was to see so many of the dead, each of their bones looked to have been placed reverently. None were simply cast into a hole or a corner. Each had been carefully placed, as if each had been a valued life. For what had to be well over an hour, they made their way through the maze of tunnels. Each section was different. Some were wide, some narrow, some with rooms to each side. After a time, Richard realized that each spot must have been carved out of the soft rock to make space for a family. That was why the niches seemed to fill every available space in such a haphazard fashion. And then they came to a section of the passage that had partially collapsed. A huge section of stone had toppled, and rubble had fallen in around it. Richard stopped and looked at the tangle of stone. "I guess this is as far as we go." Jillian squatted down, peering under the stone block lying at an angle across the passageway. "I can see a way under here." She turned to Richard. Her copper-colored eyes looked frightening, staring out from the black mask painted across her face. "I'm smaller. Do you want me to go have a quick look?" Richard held the glowing sphere down in the opening to light it for her. "All right. But I don't want you to keep going if you think it looks dangerous. There are thousands of tunnels down here, so there are plenty others to look in." "But this is the one the Lord Rahl found. It must be important." "I'm just a man, Jillian. I'm not some wise spirit returned from the world of the dead." "If you say so, Richard." At least she smiled when she said it. Jillian disappeared into the angular hole like a bird going through a thorn bush. "Lord Rahl," came her echoing voice, "there are books in here." "Books? he called into the hole. Yes, a lot of books. It's dark, but it looks like a big room with books. I'm coming in, he said. He had to take his pack off and push it out ahead as he crawled in. It turned out not to be as worrisome as he had feared, and he was soon through. When he stood on the other side, he realized that the huge stone block lying at an angle across the passage had once been a door. It looked like it had been designed to slide out of a slot cut into the side of the wall, but at some point the massive door had broken along a fault in the stone, and it had toppled over. As Richard inspected the mess, he brushed the dust away and saw one of the metal plates that activated a shield. The idea that these books had been behind a shield made his heart race faster. He turned back to the room. The warm light from the glowing sphere did indeed show a chamber full of books. The room ran at odd angles, seemingly without reason. Richard and Jillian walked along the passageway, looking at all the books. Most of the shelves were carved into the solid rock, the way the resting places for the dead had been cut out to make room. Richard held the sphere up as he started scanning the shelves. Listen, he said to Jillian. I'm looking for something specific. Chainfire. It might be a book. You start on one side and I'll take the other. Make sure you look at each book's title. Jillian nodded. If it's in here, we will find it. The ancient library was discouragingly huge. As they inched along and rounded a corner, they encountered a chamber lined with aisles of shelves. The search was slow going. They had to work in the same area so that they could both see. For several hours, they painstakingly made their way through the room. Partway through, they encountered side chambers, smaller than the main room, but still full of books. From time to time, they each had to blow dust off some of the spines. Richard was tired and frustrated by the time they came to a spot where he saw another of the metal plates. He pressed the flat of his hand against it, and the stone wall in front of them began to move. The door wasn't big, and it quickly pivoted open into blackness. He hoped that the shields keyed off what they recognized of his gift and didn't actually work by making his power answer some silent, unfelt call. He'd not like to be down in the catacombs and have the beast materialize. Richard stuck the light into the darkness and saw a small room with books. There was also a table that had long ago collapsed because some of the ceiling had come down on top of it. Jillian, deep in concentration, ran a finger along the spines of the books as she read each while Richard took 5 strides across the room to the far wall. He saw another metal plate there and pressed his hand to it. Slowly, another narrow door in the stone began pivoting away from him into the darkness. Richard crouched lower as he stepped into the doorway and held the light partway in. "Master, you wish to travel?" a voice echoed. He was staring at light reflecting back off the Slith's silver face. It was the well room where they had come in. The doorway was on the opposite side of the steps from where they had found the first metal plate that had opened the ceiling. They had just spent most of the night going around in a circle, ending up right where they had started. "Richard," Jillian said, "look at this." Richard turned back around and came face to face with the red leather cover of a book she was holding up. It said, Chainfire. Richard was so stunned that he couldn't talk. Jillian, grinning with discovery, came into the Slith's room with him as he backed in, taking the book from her hands. He felt as if he were somewhere else, watching himself hold the book named Chainfire. Chapter 62. "Richard?" It was Nietzsche's voice. Still startled to actually have found Chainfire, he walked to the steps and looked up. Both Nietzsche and Kara, silhouetted by dawn light, were peering down at him. "I found it. Jillian found it." "How did you get down there?" Nietzsche asked as Richard and Jillian started up the steps. "We just looked in there and you weren't there."
Jillian? It was a man's voice.
Grandfather!
Jillian raced the rest of the way up the steps and flew into an old man's arms. Richard climbed the steps after her. Nietzsche was sitting on the top step. What's going on?
This is Jillian's grandfather, Nietzsche said, lifting out a hand in introduction. He is the teller of these people, the keeper of the old knowledge.
Glad to meet you, Richard said, embracing the old gentleman's hand. You have a wonderful granddaughter. She just helped me out immensely.
You would have found it if I hadn't seen it first, Jillian said, grinning.
Richard smiled back. He turned to Nietzsche. What happened to Jagang's men?
Nietzsche shrugged. Night fog.
As Jillian went with her grandfather to greet Loki on a nearby wall, Richard spoke confidentially to Nietzsche and Kara. Fog?
Yes.
Nietzsche interlaced her fingers around a knee.
Some kind of strange, smoky fog drifted past them and made them go blind.
Not just blind, Kara said with obvious delight, but burst their eyes right in their sockets. It was a bloody mess. I quite enjoyed it. Richard frowned at Nietzsche, wanting an explanation.
They're scouts, she said. I know these men and they know me. I didn't want them seeing me. More than that, though, I wanted them to be useless to Jagang. The ones who live, anyway. From what Jillian's grandfather tells me, he doubts that many of them will make it back to Jagang's forces, but I made sure they were near enough to their horses so that their animals will carry them back. I want the ones who live through the ordeal to be able to report only the horror of the fog coming down from the hills, that they were blinded in a strange, forbidding, and haunted land. Such news will send a fright through his men. Raping, pillaging, and slaughtering the helpless is all perfectly entertaining for Jagang's army, but they rather don't like things like this. Dying for the Creator in a grand battle and going to their reward in the afterlife is one thing. Being taken by something they can't see coming out of the darkness and ending up helpless in this way is quite another matter. I expect that Jagang will decide to skirt this land rather than allow some unknown out here to give his men a fright that could change their minds about fighting for the glory of the Creator and the Imperial Order. That means they will have to continue on south for a good distance. It will add time to their journey before they can finally swing around and come up into Dahara.
Richard nodded thoughtfully. Very good, Nietzsche. Very good.
She beamed. What do you have there?
Chainfire. He moved up on the steps to sit between Nietzsche and Kara. It's a book. He hesitated in opening the cover. In case this is some kind of prophecy or something, I'd just as soon you looked at it first. Concern settled in her exquisite features.
Of course, Richard. Give it here.
Richard handed her the book and stood. He didn't want to risk glancing at it and too late discovering that he shouldn't have, only to discover the beast about to tear into them. Especially not now. Not when he was so close to getting answers. Nietzsche was already scanning the book, Kara looking over her shoulder. It makes no sense, Kara announced as she read from Chainfire. Richard didn't think that Nietzsche shared that opinion. Her face was draining of color.
Dear spirits, she whispered to herself.
As she kept reading, not saying anything to them, Richard sat on a rise of ground to the side under an olive tree. There was a vine growing around the trunk. He reached out to idly pluck a leaf from the vine. He stopped, his hand inches from the dusky, variegated leaves. Icy goose flesh prickled up his arms. He knew what that vine was. From the Book of Counted Shadows, the book that his father had him commit to memory before they destroyed it, the words flooded into his mind. And when the 3 boxes of Orden are put into play, the snake vine shall grow.
What's the matter? Jillian whispered to him as she leaned close. You look like you've seen a spirit.
Have you ever seen this plant growing here, where your people live?
No, I don't believe I have.
She's right, Jillian's grandfather said in a puzzled voice. I've lived in these parts all my life. I don't recall seeing that vine before, except for a spell almost 3 years back, I believe it was. That's right, 3 years this coming autumn. Then it died away. Haven't seen it since.
Richard didn't see any pods on the newly sprouted vine. He reached out and carefully plucked a sprig. "Richard, this is an incredibly dangerous book," Nietzsche said in a gravely troubled voice. She was preoccupied, still reading, and not paying any attention to the rest of them talking. "This is beyond dangerous." She was reading as she spoke. "I'm only in the beginning, but this is... I don't even know how to begin." Richard rose to his feet, holding the sprig of the vine out, staring at it. "We have to go," he said, "right now." Something in the tone of his voice made Kara and even Nietzsche look up. "Lord Ral, what is it?" Kara asked. "You look like you just saw the ghost of your father," Nietzsche said. "No, this is worse," Richard told her, finally looking up. "I understand. I know what's going on." He ran to the steps down into his tomb. "Sliff, we need to travel." "But Richard, you have come to help me cast the dreams so that the evil people will not come here." "Look, I have to leave, right now."
Lord Ral has already helped us as much as he can for now,
her grandfather said as he put an arm around her slender shoulders.
"If he can, he will return to us."
"That's right," Richard said. "If I can, I'll return. Thank you, Jillian, for helping me. You can't begin to imagine what you have done this day. Tell your people to stay away from that vine." "Richard," Nietzsche said, "what's gotten into you?" He seized Nietzsche's dress at her shoulder and Kara's arm. "We have to get to the people's palace, now." "Why? What's happening? What did you find?" Richard showed her the sprig of vine before stuffing it in a pocket and grabbing her arm again and forcing her down the steps. "This is a snake vine. It only grows when the boxes of Orden have been put in play." "But the boxes of Orden are safe in the palace," Kara protested. "They're not safe any longer. Those sisters have put the magic of Orden in play. Sliff, we need to travel to the people's palace." "Come, we will travel." Nietzsche was still fighting him as he pulled her along. "Richard, I don't see what this has to do with your dream of this woman." Richard slapped the metal plate, starting the ceiling of the tomb closing. "Goodbye, Jillian. Thank you. I will return someday." As she waved, he snatched up his bow and quiver. He turned to Nietzsche. "They need Kaelin. She's the last living confessor. They put the boxes of Orden in play. They need the book I have memorized. The first thing it says is, 'Verification of the truth of the words of the Book of Counted Shadows, if spoken by another rather than read by the one who commands the boxes, can only be ensured by the use of a confessor.'" The ceiling finished closing. In the distance, Richard could hear Jillian call, "Goodbye, Richard. Safe journey." "Richard, this is crazy. It's just—" "Now is not the time to argue with me." She knew by his tone of voice that he meant it. He climbed up on the wall and hoisted both women up. "Here, wait," Nietzsche said as she opened the pack. "You had better keep this safe." She stuffed Chainfire down inside and tied the flap down tight. "Any idea what Chainfire is about?" he asked. Her blue eyes gazed into his. "From what I was able to tell from the tiny bit I saw in the beginning, it's a theoretical formula for conjuring things that have the potential to unravel existence." "Unravel existence?" Kara asked. "What does that mean?" "I'm not exactly sure, but it seems to be a discussion of a theory of a specific magic that, if ever initiated, could potentially destroy the world of life." "Why in the world would they need that?" Richard asked. "They have the magic of Orden now." Nietzsche didn't answer. She didn't believe his theory. It involved Kaelin. "Sliff, now please. Take us to the people's palace." The silver arm swept them up. "Come, we will travel." Just before they plunged into the silvery froth, Nietzsche and Kara each seized one of his hands. Chapter 63. Nietzsche had hardly gotten her bearings, hardly recognized that they were in a marble room, hardly let the sniff out of her lungs and pulled in a desperate gasp of air when Richard was already pulling her up over the wall by the hand. Despite everything, she was still able, in some dim part of her mind, to thrill at holding his hand, for whatever reason. She had thought that, while in the sliff traveling to the People's Palace, that she would be able to give thought to Richard's strange new twist of finding a bit of a vine and leaping to the conclusion that the boxes of Orden were in play, all in an attempt to prove that Kaelin was real. The room they were in was shielded. Richard pulled her and Kara through the powerful shield. They ran up a marble hall and out a double silver door with a lake embossed into the metal. "I know this place," Kara said. "I know where we are." "Good," Richard said. "Then you lead the way, and hurry." There were times when Nietzsche almost wished that she had gone along with Zed, Anne, and Nathan's plan to purge him of his memory of Kaelin. Except for one thing. She had tried the theory on one of Jagang's men back in Casca. She had tried to use subtractive magic to eliminate the man's memory of the Emperor. It sounded simple enough. She had done just as the three had wanted Nietzsche to do to Richard. There had only been one problem. It had killed the man. Killed him in a most horrifying fashion. When she had thought about how she had almost done that to Richard, how for a time she had let them talk her into it, and had committed to doing it, she had gotten so weak and dizzy that she had to sit down on the ground next to the dead soldier. Kara had thought Nietzsche had been about to pass out. The idea of what she had almost done left her shaking for an hour. "Here," Kara said, as she led them upstairs that emptied into a broad corridor with parts of the roof glassed. The light flooding in was reddish, so it was either almost sunset or just after dawn. Nietzsche didn't know which. It was a disorienting feeling not to know if it was day or night. The halls were filled with people. Many of them stopped to stare at the three people running along the corridor. Guards also noticed and came running, hands to weapons, until they saw Kara in her red leather outfit. Many of the people recognized Richard and dropped to a knee, bowing as he ran past. He didn't slow to acknowledge them. They went up a dizzying array of passages, over bridges, along balconies, between columns, and through rooms. Intermittently, they ran up the stairs. Occasionally, Kara took them through service halls, undoubtedly as shortcuts. Nietzsche took note of how magnificent the palace was, how remarkably beautiful. The patterned stone floors were laid with rare precision. There were grand statues, none as remarkable as the statue Richard had carved, but grand nonetheless. She saw a tapestry that was larger than any she had seen in her life. It depicted a sprawling battle and must have had several hundred horses in it. "This way," Kara said, pointing down a hall as she rushed toward it. As they came around the corner, Kara crossed over to the other side of the passageway as she ran down it. Nietzsche, pulled along by her hand, would have liked to have discussed a number of things, to have asked some important and pointed questions, but it was all she could do to get her breath as she ran. Running was not something she really ever did until she met Richard. Kara slid to slow down as she came to a pair of carved mahogany doors. Nietzsche was revolted to see the snakes carved into them. Without pause, Richard seized one of the door handles, a bronze skull, and yanked the door open. Inside the quiet carpeted room, 4 guards immediately sprang to block Richard's path. They saw Kara and looked at Richard again, uncertain. "Lord Rahl?" one asked. "That's right," Kara snapped. "Now get out of the way." The men immediately pulled back, each putting a fist to their hearts. "Has anything happened recently?" Richard asked as he caught his breath. "Happened?" "Intruders. Has anyone slipped in this way?" The man snorted a laugh. "Hardly, Lord Rahl. We'd know if that happened, and we'd not allow it." Richard nodded his thanks and raced to the marble stairs, nearly pulling Nietzsche's arm out of the socket in the process. As they ran up the steps, Nietzsche thought that her legs might simply quit. Her muscles were so exhausted from the long run up through the palace that she could hardly make them go on. But she had to, for Richard. At the top of the stairs, soldiers were running toward them, crossbows loaded with red-fletched arrows at the ready. They didn't know it was the Lord Rahl. They thought that someone was trying to get into the restricted area. Nietzsche hoped that someone got hold of their senses before one of the men got careless. But by their reactions, Nietzsche realized that these men were highly trained and not prone to shooting arrows before they were sure of their target. Lucky for them, because she would have been faster. "Commander General Trimac?" Richard asked an officer pushing his way through the ring of steel that had surrounded them. The man stiffened and clapped a fist to his heart. "Lord Rahl!" He spotted the moored Sith. "Kara?" Kara nodded in greeting. Richard clasped arms with the man. "General, someone has gotten in here. They've taken the boxes in the Garden of Life." The general was momentarily struck speechless. "What? Lord Rahl, that's not possible. You have to be mistaken. No one could get past us without our knowing it. It's been peaceful as can be up here for ages. Why, we've only had one visitor." "Visitor? Who?" "The prelate, Verna. It was a while back. She was in the palace checking on something about the books of magic, she said. She said that as long as she was here, she wanted to have a look to make sure the boxes were safe." "So you let her go in there?" The general looked a bit indignant. A long scar stood out white when his face went red. "No, Lord Rahl. I wouldn't let her go in there. What we ended up doing was opening the doors, so she could look in to see that everything was safe." "Look in?" "That's right. We surrounded her with men, all pointing these special arrows at her. Arrows Nathan Rahl found for us that will stop even the gifted. We had her ringed in steel. The poor woman looked like a pincushion about to happen." Men all around nodded at the general's words. "She looked in the garden and said she was relieved to see that everything was fine. I took a look myself and saw the 3 black boxes sitting on the stone slab across the room. But I never let the woman set foot beyond the doors, I swear." Richard heaved a sigh. "And that's it? No one else has opened those doors?" "No, Lord Rahl. No one else has even been up here but my men. No one. We don't let anyone even use these halls around the Garden of Life. As you may recall, you were rather insistent about it the last time you were here." Richard nodded, thinking. He looked up. "Well, let's go have a look." The men, all jangling with weapons and armor, followed the surprise visitors down the polished granite hall until they reached 2 huge gold-covered doors. Without waiting for someone else to do it, Richard pulled one of the heavy doors open and started into the room. The soldiers paused at the doors. This was apparently sacred ground, a sanctuary for the master of the palace alone, and unless invited by the Lord Rahl, none of them would enter. Richard didn't invite them as he rushed off on his own. Despite how tired she was, Nietzsche hurried after him as he made his way down a path among beds of flowers. Overhead, through a glassed roof, she could see that the sky had turned to a darker purple, so she knew it was night rather than dawn. Just like Richard, Nietzsche paid little attention to the vine-covered walls or the trees or all the other things growing all around. The garden was a magnificent place, to be sure, but her gaze was riveted on the stone altar she saw in the distance. She didn't see any of the 3 boxes that were supposed to be there. There was something else standing on the slab of granite, but she couldn't tell what it was. By the way Richard's chest was heaving, he did know what was standing there. They crossed a ring of grass and the open dirt. In the dirt, Richard stopped cold in mid-stride and stared down at the ground. "Lord Rahl," Kara asked, "what is it?" "Her tracks," he whispered. "I recognize them. These aren't covered by magic. She was here, alone." He gestured to the dirt. 2 sets. She was in here twice. He looked back at the grass, following what he could see that they couldn't. She was on her knees there in the grass. He took off and ran the rest of the way to the stone altar. Nietzsche and Kara sprang into a run to keep up with him. When they reached the slab of granite, Nietzsche knew at last what it was that stood there all alone. It was the statue of the woman that had been carved in marble in Liberty Square in Al-Tourang. The original statue Richard had told them he had carved. The statue, he said, belonged to Kalin. Nietzsche could see that there were bloody handprints all over it. Richard picked up the carved wooden figure in trembling hands and drew it to his breast, gasping back a sob. Nietzsche thought that he might fall to the ground, but he didn't. When he had held it for a moment, he turned to them, tears running down his face. He held out to Kara and Nietzsche the statue of the proud figure, her head thrown back, her hands fisted at her sides. "This is the statue I carved for Kalin. This is spirit. This is the statue I told you could not be in Al-Tourang because she had it with her. If they copied this statue in stone down in Al-Tourang in the old world, then how did it get here?" Nietzsche stared at it, her eyes wide, trying to reconcile what she was seeing. She couldn't comprehend the contradiction. She remembered Richard trying to understand what he had seen at the gravesite where the Mother Confessor was buried. Now she knew how he had felt. "Richard, I don't understand how that could have gotten here." "Kalin left it here. She left it here for me to find. She took the boxes of Orden for the sisters. Don't you get it? Don't you at last see the truth standing before you?" Unable to say more, he pulled the statue back to his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Page 634. In that moment, seeing the pain trembling through him, Nietzsche wondered what it would be like to have him love her that much. At the same time, despite her confusion, despite sadness for what she was seeing, for the pain he was so obviously in, she felt joy. Joy that Richard had someone who meant that much to him, someone who could make him feel that way, even if she was imaginary. Nietzsche was not yet convinced that she wasn't. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "Do you two get it now?" Kara, looking as stunned as Nietzsche felt, shook her head. "No, Lord Ral, I don't understand." He lifted the small statue. "No one remembers her. She probably walked right past those men and they forgot her, just like you forgot all the thousands of times you've seen her. She's all alone in the hands of those 4 sisters, and they made her come in here and get the boxes. Do you see the blood all over it? Her blood? You should understand that. Can you imagine how she feels all alone, forgotten by everyone? She left this, probably hoping someone would see it and know she exists." He thrust it at Kara, then at Nietzsche. "Look at it. It's covered in blood. There's blood on the altar. There's blood on the floor. There are her footprints. How do you think the boxes are gone and this is here? She was here." The indoor garden was dead silent. Nietzsche was so confused she didn't know what to believe. She knew what she was seeing, but it didn't seem possible. "Do you believe me now?" Richard asked them both. Kara swallowed. "Lord Ral, I believe what you are saying, but I still don't remember her." When his raptor gaze slid to Nietzsche, she too swallowed at the power of that look. "Richard, I don't know what is going on. What you say is certainly powerful evidence, but like Kara says, I still don't remember her. I'm sorry, but I can't lie to you and tell you what you want to hear just to make you happy. I'm telling you the truth. I still don't know what you're talking about." "I know you don't," he said with sudden, quiet, remarkable sympathy. "It's what I've been telling you. Something terrible is happening. No one remembers her. Anything that could cause such an event is undoubtedly powerful and extremely dangerous conjuring, able to be engendered only by the most powerful people who have command of both sides of the gift. Magic so dangerous that it would be hidden in a book buried in a catacomb behind shields where the wizards who put it there hoped no one would ever find it." Chainfire, Nietzsche breathed. But from the brief bit I saw of it, this somehow has the power to undo the world of life.
What do the sisters care? Richard asked in a bitter voice. They've already put the boxes of Orden in play. It is their intent to end life on behalf of the keeper of the dead. You should understand that better than anyone.
Nietzsche put a hand to her forehead. Dear spirits, I think you may be right. She couldn't feel her fingertips. She was tingling all over with dread. From the little bit I read, Chainfire sounds like it might be something along the lines of what Zed, Anne, and Nathan wanted me to do to you. Use subtractive magic to make you forget Kaelin. If what you say is true, then in a way, that might be what the sisters did. They made everyone else forget her. Nietzsche looked up into his gray eyes, eyes she could lose herself in. She felt tears of fright run down her cheeks. Richard, I tried that.
What are you talking about?
I tried what they wanted me to do to you. I tried it on one of Jagang's men back in Casca. Tried to make him forget Jagang. It was fatal. What if that's what Chainfire does to everyone?
Richard heaved an angry breath. Come on. He marched out of the garden to a general and his guards waiting out in the polished granite hallway, huddled around the entrance to the Garden of Life. Lord Rahl, the general said, I don't see the boxes anymore. They've been stolen. Jaws of men standing all around dropped in stunned astonishment. General Trimak's eyes went wide. Stolen? But who could have stolen them? Richard held up the statue and waggled it in front of the man. My wife. General Trimak looked like he didn't know whether to scream in fury or commit suicide on the spot. He instead rubbed a hand back and forth on his mouth as he thought through everything he'd heard and apparently tried to put it together with any other information he had. He looked up at Richard with the kind of intent look that few men other than generals could muster. I get reports all the time, Lord Rahl. I insist that I see all reports. You never can tell what bit of information you might learn that could turn out to be helpful. General Meifert sends me reports as well. Since he's now close by, I get them within hours. Soon he and the troops will be moving south, and it will take longer, but for now I get them fresh. I'm listening. Well, I don't know if it means anything, but the latest report I got early this morning said that they came across a woman, an old woman, who had been stabbed by a sword. She's in bad shape, according to the report. I don't know why he sent me a report on such a thing, but General Meifert is a pretty smart fellow, and I have to think that there was just something bloody odd about it for him to want me to know. How close is he? Richard asked. The army, I mean. How close? The general shrugged. By horse? Ride halfway hard, and they're not more than an hour or two away. Then get me some horses, immediately. General Trimak clapped a hand over his heart at the same time as he signaled a couple men forward. Run on ahead, and get some horses ready for the Lord Rahl. He looked at Richard, then glanced at Kara and Nietzsche. 3 horses? Yes, 3, Richard confirmed. And an escort of the first file to show him the way and provide protection. The 2 men nodded and took off at a dead run for the stairs. Lord Rahl, I don't know what to say. I will, of course, resign. Don't be silly. This isn't something you could have done anything about. It was deception by magic. It's my fault for letting this happen. I'm the Lord Rahl. I'm supposed to be the magic against magic. Nietzsche could only think that he had been trying to be, but no one would believe him. Without sparing any time to rest, Richard, Kara, and Nietzsche, escorted by a company of the palace guards, rushed through the grand, wide corridors of Richard's ancestral home. People along their route scattered out of the way of the wedge of guards coming down the halls. Behind the guards, Kara marched out in front of Richard. Nietzsche rushed along at his side. As they made their way down a smaller corridor with fewer people, Richard slowed and then stopped. The guards stopped far enough away to be handy, but to give him his privacy. As everyone waited,
Richard gazed down a side passageway. Kara looked uncomfortable. "Quarters for Mord Sith," Kara explained to Nietzsche in answer to the unspoken question in her eyes. "Denna's room was down that hall." Richard gestured the other way. "Your room was down there, Kara." Kara blinked. "How do you know that?" He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Kara, I remember being there." Kara turned as red as her leather outfit. "You remember?" Richard nodded. "You know?" she whispered, panic coming into her eyes. "Kara," he said gently, "of course I know." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "How did you know?" He gestured to her right wrist. "When I've touched your Aegil, it hurts. An Aegil only hurts when a person touches it if it was used to train them, or if the Mord Sith intends it to hurt." She closed her eyes. "Lord Rahl, I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago when you were a different person, and I was the enemy of your Lord Rahl. Things change, Kara." "Are you sure I've changed enough?" "Others made you into who you were. You made yourself into what you have become." He smiled. "Remember when the beast hurt you and I healed you?" "How could I ever forget it?" "Then you know how I feel." She smiled at that. Richard's brow drew together. Touch. His eyes lit up with sudden recognition. The sword. "What?" Nietzsche asked. "The sword of truth. That morning, when I was asleep, I think the sisters cast a spell to make me sleep more soundly so they could take Kalen. But I put my hand on the sword. I was touching the sword of truth when they took her and made everyone forget Kalen. The sword protected me from that magic. That's why I remember her. The sword of truth was a countermeasure to what they did." Richard started out again. "Come on. We need to get to the encampment and see who that injured woman is." Baffled, Nietzsche followed after him. Chapter 64. Nietzsche was surprised by the encampment. She was so used to being among Jagang's army that she hadn't really given any thought to how different these men might be. It made sense, of course, but she had just never given it any thought. Even in the dark, there was still the light of all the fires, and she expected to be the center of morbid attention, with men calling out the filthiest things they could think of in an attempt to shock her or humiliate her or frighten her. Men in the order encampment always hooted and hollered at her, made obscene gestures, and laughed uproariously as she passed among them. These men, to be sure, looked her way. Nietzsche expected that it was a rare experience to see a woman like her riding into their camp. But they only looked. A glance, an admiring gaze, a smile here and there with a bow of the head in greeting was the most she got. It could be that she was riding in beside the Lord Rahl and a Mord Sith in red leather, but Nietzsche didn't think so. These men were different. They were expected to conduct themselves with respect. Everywhere when men saw Richard, they were eager to clap a fist to their hearts in salute as they stood in pride or trotted alone beside his horse for a time. They looked overjoyed to see him riding into their camp, to see their Lord Rahl among them again. The camp was also more orderly as well. That it was dry was a help. There were few things worse than an army camp in the wet. In this camp, the animals were confined to areas where they wouldn't accidentally create trouble. Wagons were out of the main route through the camp. There actually were deliberate routes through the camp. The men looked weary from the long march, but their tents were set up in a rather systematic manner, not the haphazard every man for himself method the imperial order employed. The fires were small, and were only what was needed, not the drunken revelry of men dancing, singing, and brawling around the bonfires. The other big difference was that there were not any torture tents set up. The order always had an active area set aside for torture. A steady stream of people flowed in for questioning, and an equal number of corpses flowed out. The constant screams from victims made for a noisy camp. That was the other thing. It was rather quiet. Men were finishing with meals and bedding down for the night. It was a quiet time. In the orders encampment, there wasn't any time that was quiet. "There," one of the men escorting them said as he lifted an arm to point out the command tents in the darkness. A big, blond-headed officer came out of one of the tents when he heard horses nearby. He had undoubtedly already been alerted that the Lord Rahl was on his way. Richard swung down off the saddle and stopped the man from going to his knees to do a devotion. "General Myford, it's good to see you again, but we don't have time for that." He bowed his head. "As you wish, Lord Rahl." Nietzsche watched the general's blue eyes glance to Kara as she came up beside Richard. He smoothed back his blonde hair. "Mistress Kara?" "General?" "Life is too short for you two to pretend you don't care for each other," Richard said, his anger surfacing. "You ought to realize that every moment you have together is precious, and there is nothing wrong with holding someone in high regard. That's the kind of freedom we're fighting for." "Well, isn't it?" "Yes, Lord Rahl," General Myford said, somewhat taken aback. "We're here because of a report you sent about a woman who was stabbed. Is she still alive?" The young general nodded. "I haven't checked in the last hour or so, but she was earlier. My field surgeons attended to her, but there are wounds well beyond their ability. This is one of those. She was stabbed in the gut. It's a slow and painful way to die. She's lived longer than I expected." "Do you know her name?" Nietzsche asked. "She wouldn't tell us when she was wide awake, but when she was in a fevered state we asked again, and she said her name was Tovi." Richard glanced at Nietzsche before asking, "What does she look like?" "Heavy-set, older woman." "Sounds like her," Richard said as he wiped a hand across his face. "We need to see her, right away." The general nodded. "Follow me then." "Wait," Nietzsche said. Richard turned back to her. "What is it?" "If you go in to see her, she won't tell you anything. Tovi hasn't seen me for ages. The last she knew, I was still a slave to Jagang, and she had escaped. I might be able to talk to her in a way that will get the truth out of her." Nietzsche could see how impatient Richard was to get his hands on one of the women that he believed was responsible for taking the woman he loved. Nietzsche still didn't know what she believed. She wondered if she still believed that he was only dreaming up this other woman simply because of her own feelings. "Richard," she said as she stepped close to him so that she could talk confidentially, "let me do this. If you go in there, it will spoil what I can do. I think I can get her to talk. But if she sees you, the game will be over." "And how do you plan to accomplish getting her to talk?" "Look, do you want to know what happened to Kaylin, or do you want to argue about how I'm going to get that information?" He pressed his lips tight for a moment. "I don't care if you pull her intestines out an inch at a time, just get her to talk." Nietzsche briefly put a hand on his shoulder on her way by as she followed after the general. Once they were away, she moved up and walked beside him as they marched through the nearly dark camp. She could see why Kara found the man attractive. He had one of those handsome faces that just didn't look like it could wear a lie well at all. "By the way," he said, glancing over at her, "I'm General Myford." Nietzsche nodded. "Benjamin?" He paused in the dark pathway through the camp. "How do you know that?" Nietzsche smiled. "Kara told me about you." Still, he stared at her. She took his arm and started him moving again. "And for a Maud Sith to speak so highly of a man is quite unusual." "Kara spoke highly of me?" "Of course, she likes you, but you know that." He clasped his hands behind his back as they walked. "I guess, then, that you must know that I think a lot of her." "Of course." "And who are you, anyway, might I ask? I'm sorry, but Lord Rahl didn't introduce us." Nietzsche gave him a sidelong glance. "You may have heard of me as Death's mistress." General Myford stumbled to a stop, choking on spit from gasping. He coughed until his face was red. "Death's mistress," he finally managed. "People are more afraid of you than Jagang himself." "For good reason." "You're the one who captured Lord Rahl and took him to the old world." "That's right," she said as she started out again. He walked along beside her, thinking it over.
Well, I'd guess that you must have changed your ways, or Lord Raoul wouldn't have you with him.
She simply smiled at him, a smooth, sly smile. It made him uneasy. He gestured to the right.
Down here. The tent where we put her is over here.
Nietzsche grasped his forearm to hold him in place. She didn't want Tovey hearing her yet. "This is going to take a goodly amount of time. Why don't you tell Richard that I said he should get some rest? I think Kara ought to get some rest, too. Why don't you see to that as well?"
Ah, I guess I could do that.
"And, General, if my friend Kara doesn't leave here in the morning with a giddy grin, I'll gut you alive." His eyes widened. Nietzsche couldn't help but to smile. "Figure of speech, Benjamin." She arched an eyebrow. "You have the night with her. Don't waste it." He smiled at last.
Thank you.
"Nietzsche."
Thank you, Nietzsche. I think about her all the time. You don't know how much I've missed her, how much I've worried about her.
"I think I do. But you should tell her that, not me. Now, where is Tovey?" He lifted an arm and pointed.
Down there on the right, the last tent in the line.
Nietzsche nodded. "Do me a favor. See to it that no one disturbs us, including the surgeons. I need to be alone with her."
I'll see to it.
He turned back and scratched his head.
It's none of my business, but are you...
He gestured between her and back the way they'd come.
You and Lord Raoul, well, you know.
Nietzsche couldn't seem to make herself come up with an answer that she wished to voice. "Time is short. Don't keep Kara waiting."
Yes, I see what you mean. Thank you, Nietzsche. I hope to see you in the morning.
She watched him rush off into the darkness, then turned to her task. She hadn't really wanted to unnerve the general with talk of Death's mistress, but she needed to slip back into that part of herself, needed to think that way again, needed to find the icy attitude that was numb to everything. She pulled the tent flap aside and slipped inside. There was a single candle lit on a holder made of wrought iron that was stuck in the ground beside a cot. The tent was stuffy and warm. It smelled of stale sweat and dried blood. Tovey's bulk lay on her back in the cot, laboring to breathe. Nietzsche sat lightly on a field stool beside the woman. Tovey hardly noticed someone sitting down. Nietzsche laid a hand on Tovey's wrist and began to trickle in a thread of power to help the woman suffering. Tovey recognized such gifted help and immediately looked over. Her eyes went wide and her breathing quickened. She then gasped in pain and clutched at her abdomen. Nietzsche increased the flow of power until Tovey sagged back with a moan of relief.
"Nietzsche, where have you come from? What in the world are you doing here?"
"Well, since when do you care? Sister Ulyssia and the rest of you left me in Jagang's clutches. His personal slave left me a captive of that pig."
"But you got away."
"Got away? Sister Tovey, are you out of your mind? No one got away from Dreamwalker except you five."
"4. Sister Marissa is no longer living."
"What happened?"
"Stupid bitch tried to play her own game with Richard Rawl. You remember how she hated him, wanted to bathe in his blood."
"I remember."
"Sister Nietzsche, what are you doing here?"
"The rest of you left me to Jagang." Nietzsche leaned in so that Tovey could see her glare. "You have no idea of the things I've had to endure. Since then, I've been on a long mission for His Excellency. He needs information, and he knows I can get it." Tovey smiled.
"Makes you whore for him to find out what he wants to know."
Nietzsche didn't answer the question, instead letting it answer itself. "I just happened to hear about some fool woman who, in the process of getting herself robbed or something, also managed to get herself stabbed. Something about the description made me decide to come and check myself to see if it could possibly be you." Tovey nodded.
I'm afraid it's not good.
I hope it hurts. I came to make sure you're a long time dying. I want you to suffer for what you did to me, leaving me in the clutches of Jagang while the rest of you escaped without bothering to even tell me how it could be done.
We couldn't help it. We had a chance, and we had to take it, that's all.
A cunning grin came to her.
But you can get free of Jagang, too.
Nietzsche pressed forward. How? How can I get free?
Heal me and I'll tell you.
You mean heal you so you can betray me like before. No good, Tovey. You're going to tell it all, or I'm going to sit right here and watch you suffer your way into the Keeper's eternal embrace. I may trickle in just enough to keep you alive a little longer. She leaned in. So you can continue to feel the pain twisting in your guts a little longer. Tovey seized a fistful of Nietzsche's dress.
Please, sister, help me. It hurts so much.
Talk, sister. She released her grip on Nietzsche's dress and let her face roll to face away.
It's the bond to Lord Rahl. We swore a bond.
Sister Tovey, if you think I'm that stupid, I'm going to make you suffer just to make you regret the thought until you die. She turned back to look at Nietzsche.
No, it's true.
How can you swear a bond to someone you want to eliminate? Tovey grinned.
Sister Ulyssia figured it out. We swore a bond to him, but made him let us go before he could hold us to a list of his commands.
This story just gets more preposterous all the time. Nietzsche withdrew her hand from Tovey's arm, and with it the trickle of relief. As Nietzsche stood, Tovey groaned in agony.
Please, Sister Nietzsche, it's true.
She grasped Nietzsche's hand.
In exchange for letting us go, we traded for something he wanted.
What could Lord Rahl possibly want that would convince him to let a clutch of Sisters of the Dark loose? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
A woman.
What?
He wanted a woman.
As the Lord Rahl, he can have any woman he wants. He has but to pick her and have her sent to his bed, unless she would choose the executioner's block instead, and none do. He hardly needs the Sisters of the Dark to cart women to his bed.
No, not that kind of woman, a woman he loved.
Right. Nietzsche huffed a sigh. Goodbye, Sister Tovey. Be sure to give the Keeper of the Dead my regards when you get there. Sorry, but I'm afraid that meeting won't be for a while. I think you look like you may linger for a number of days yet. Pity.
Please.
Her arm rotated around, searching for the contact of the one person who could save her.
Sister Nietzsche, please. Please listen, and I will tell you everything.
Nietzsche sat down and gripped Tovey's arm again. All right, sister, but just remember, the power can go both ways. Tovey's back arched as she cried out in agony.
No, please!
Nietzsche had no compunction about what she was doing. She knew that there was no moral equivalence between her inflicting torture and the Imperial Order doing what might on the surface seem like the same thing. But her purpose in using it was solely to save innocent lives. The Imperial Order used torture as a means of subjugation and conquest, as a tool to strike fear into their enemies, and at times as something they relished because it made them feel powerful to hold sway over not just agony, but life itself. The Imperial Order used torture because they had no regard at all for human life. Nietzsche was using it because she did, while at one time she would have seen no difference. Since coming to embrace life, she saw all the difference in the world. Nietzsche reversed the suffering she was trickling into the old woman, and Tovey sank back in grateful, weeping relief. Tovey was covered in a sheen of sweat.
Please, sister, give me some comfort instead, and I will tell you everything.
Start with who stabbed you.
The Seeker.
Richard Rahl is the Seeker. Do you really think I will believe such a story? Richard Rahl would have taken your head off with one swing. Tovy's head rolled side to side.
No, no, you don't understand. This man had the sword of truth. She pointed at her gut. I ought to know the sword of truth when it runs me through. He caught me by surprise, and before I knew who he was or what he wanted, the bastard stabbed me.
Nietzsche pressed her fingers to her brow in confusion. I think you better go back to the beginning. Tovy was already sinking into a stupor. Nietzsche increased the magic flowing into her, giving her some healing relief without curing her of her injury. Nietzsche didn't want to cure her. She needed the woman unable to help herself. Tovy looked the kindly grandmother, but she was a viper. Nietzsche crossed one leg over the other. It was going to be a long night. The next time Tovy came around, Nietzsche sat up straighter. So you swore a bond to Richard as the Lord Raoul, Nietzsche said, as if there had been no gap in the conversation. And that protected all of you from the Dreamwalker?
That's right.
And then what?
We were able to escape. We kept track of Richard as we went about our work for our master. We needed to find a hook.
Nietzsche knew very well who their master was. What do you mean, a hook?
In order to do what we needed to do to satisfy the Keeper, we needed a way to make sure Richard Raoul could not interfere. We found it.
Found what?
Something that keeps us bonded to him no matter what we do. It was brilliant.
So, what is it?
Life.
Nietzsche frowned, not knowing if she had heard right. She laid a hand on Tovy's wound and gave some focused comfort. After Tovy had calmed from the wave of pain, Nietzsche asked in a quiet voice, What do you mean?
Life, Tovy said at last. It is his highest value.
So?
Sister, think, in order to stay out of the Dreamwalker's grasp, we must be bonded to Richard Raoul all the time. We dare not waver for a moment. And yet who is our ultimate master?
The Keeper of the Dead. We have sworn oaths.
That's right. And if we were to do something that would harm Richard's life, such as loose the Keeper into the world of life, then we would be going against our bond to Richard. That would mean that before we could free the Keeper from his bounds in the world of the dead, Jagang in this world would be able to pounce on us.
Sister Tovy, you had better start making sense, or I will lose my patience, and I assure you, you would not like that. You would not like it one bit. I want to know what's going on so that I can be let in. I want my place back.
Of course, of course. You see, Richard's highest value is life. In fact, he created the statue to it. We were in the old world. We saw his statue dedicated to life.
I got that much out of what you said. Her head rolled back so she could again look at Nietzsche.
Well, my dear, what is it we are pledged to do in the oaths we have given?
Free the Keeper.
And what is our reward for performing our task?
Nietzsche stared at the woman's cold eyes. Immortality. Tovy grinned.
Exactly.
Richard's highest value is life. You are saying that you plan to grant him immortality?
We are working toward his most noble ideal, life.
But he may not want immortality. Tovy managed a shrug.
Maybe, but we don't intend to ask him. Don't you see the brilliance of Sister Ulysses' plan? We know that his highest value is life. No matter what else we may do against his wishes, those things do not rise to the level of his most important value. Thus we are honoring our bond to the Lord Raoul in the most grand way possible, while maintaining the bond, keeping the Dreamwalker out of our minds, and at the same time working to bring the Keeper into the world. See how it goes round and round? Each element locks the others in tighter.
But it is the Keeper who promises you immortality. You cannot grant it.
No, not if we seek it through the Keeper.
Then how can you possibly grant immortality? You don't have any such power.
Oh, but we will. We will.
How? Tovey fell to coughing, and Nietzsche had to do some swift work on the wound just to keep the woman alive. It was nearly 2 hours before she again had her conscious and calm. "Sister Tovey," she said once the woman had opened her eyes and looked like she was seeing again, "I've had to repair some of your injury. Now, before I can repair the rest of your wound and fully heal you so that you can have your reward of life, I need to know the rest of it. How can you think that you can grant immortality? You don't have that power."
"We stole the boxes of Auden. We intend to use them to destroy all life, except that which we wish to have around, of course. With the power of Auden, we will hold sway over life and death. We will have the power to grant Richard Rahl immortality. See? Bond fulfilled."
Nietzsche's head was spinning. "Tovey, your story is too impossible. It's more complicated than you make it."
"Well, there are other parts to the plan. We found catacombs under the Palace of the Prophets."
Nietzsche had had no idea that such catacombs existed, but she wanted the woman to go on with her story, so she just let her talk.
"That's when it all started, when we got the idea. You see, we had been wandering the lands looking for ways to satisfy the Keeper."
She clutched Nietzsche's arm so hard it hurt.
"He comes in our dreams. You know that. He comes to you as well. He comes and torments us, forcing us to do his bidding, to work to free him."
Nietzsche pulled the claw-like hand off her arm. "Catacombs?"
"Yes, the catacombs. We discovered ancient catacombs, and in them books. We found a book called Chainfire."
Goosebumps ran up Nietzsche's arms. "Chainfire? What does that mean? Is it a spell?"
"Oh, it is much more than anything so simple as a spell. It was from ancient times. The wizards of the time had come up with a new theory of how to alter memory. In other words, real events altered with subtractive power, with all the disconnected parts spontaneously reconstructed independently of one another. Namely, how to make an individual disappear to everyone else by making people forget this person, even as soon as they've just seen them. But the wizards who came up with this theory were timid men, fearful of unleashing such things not only because they realized that such a linked event would cause irreparable damage to the subject, but because there was no way for them to control it once it was initiated. It would be self-actuating and self-sustaining."
"What do you mean? What does it do?"
"It unravels people's memory of the subject, but that ignition starts a cascade event that can't be predicted or controlled. It then burns through links they have with others, and then others those people know, and so on. It eventually unravels connections so that it corrupts everything. For our purposes, though, it doesn't really matter, since our aim is to undo life anyway. For fear that it would be discovered what we were doing, we destroyed the book and the catacombs."
"But why did you need to destroy the memory of someone?"
"Not just anyone, but the memory of the woman who bought us the bond in the first place, Kaylin Amnell, Richard Rahl's love. By creating a Chainfire event, we ended up with a woman no one remembers."
"But what can that possibly gain you?"
"The boxes of Auden. We used her to get the boxes so that we can free the Keeper. With the boxes, we can grant Richard immortal life at the same time we also free the Keeper. The Keeper whispered to us in our dreams that Richard has the secret to opening the boxes. He has a necessary knowledge memorized. It exists nowhere else. Darken Rahl revealed it to the Keeper. Richard knows the way to unlock the secrets of Auden, only this time we know the trick that defeated Darken Rahl. The book he knows says that we need a confessor to open the boxes, and now we have a confessor who no one remembers, so no one can bother us about her."
"What about prophecy disappearing? Was that caused by Chainfire?"
"It's part of Chainfire. They called it the Chainfire Corollary. Part of the initiation phase of Chainfire requires that prophecy also be ignited with a Chainfire event, much the same as people's memories are cast into the conflagration. The Chainfire event feeds on those memories to sustain the event, therefore prophecy must be involved as well. A blank is found in the proper fork, a place where a prophet left a space should a future prophet wish to complete the work. We then fill in that void in prophecy with a completing prophecy which has the Chainfire formula invested in it. A Chainfire event thus infects and consumes all the associated prophecy on the branch, starting with related prophecy, either in subject or in chronology. In this case, both. Kaelin, the woman we wiped away in life, is thus also wiped away in prophecy by the Chainfire corollary.
You seem to have it all worked out, Nietzsche said. Tovey grinned through the pain.
It gets better.
Better? How could it possibly get more delicious than this?
There is a counter to Chainfire.
Tovey giggled with the glee of it. A counter? You mean you risk Richard finding a counter to what you have done? A counter that could bring the entire plan crashing down? Tovey tried to stifle the giggle, but it bubbled up again. Despite the obvious pain, she was enjoying herself too much to stop.
This is the best part of all. The ancient wizards who came up with the Chainfire theory realized the potential for the total destruction of life. So they created a counter, should a Chainfire event ever somehow come to pass.
Nietzsche gritted her teeth. What counter?
The boxes of Orden.
Nietzsche's eyes widened. The boxes of Orden were created to be the counter to the Chainfire event you've initiated?
That's right. Isn't that delicious? What's more, we've put the boxes in play.
Nietzsche let out a deep breath. Well, like I said, you seem to have it all figured out.
Tovey winced. Well, almost. There is only one minor issue.
Like what?
Well, you see, the stupid bitch only brought out one box the first time we sent her in. We couldn't allow the boxes to be seen because, unlike Richard's love, people would remember seeing the boxes of Orden. Kaelin said she had no room in her pack. Sister Ulyssia was furious. She beat the girl to a bloody mess. You would have loved it, Sister Nietzsche. And told her to leave something out to make room if she had to, then sent her back in to get the other 2 boxes.
Tovey winced under a pang of pain.
We feared to wait, though. Sister Ulyssia sent me on with the first box, and said she would catch up with me later.
Tovey groaned under the agony of another stitch of pain.
I had the first box with me. The Seeker, the one with Sword of Truth anyway, surprised me and ran me through. He snatched the box. Once Kaelin finally retrieved them, Sister Ulyssia then had those 2 and thought that I had the third, so before she left the palace she put the magic of Orden in play.
Nietzsche staggered to her feet. She felt dizzy. She could hardly believe it, but she knew now that it was all true. Richard had been right all along. With almost nothing to go on, he had basically figured it all out. And all along, no one in the world would listen to him. No one in a world that was unraveling around them in an uncontrolled Chainfire event. Chapter 65. A scream that made the fine hairs on the back of Richard's neck stand on end split the quiet night. Richard, in a bedroll in a simple tent, shot to his feet as the scream ripped the air with its terror. The unending shriek ran a shiver up through his shoulders and instantly brought a sheen of sweat to his brow. His heart racing, Richard rushed out of his tent even as the haunting cry echoed through the encampment, as if trying to reach every corner of darkness to express its horror. Outside the tent, which was set apart from the others because it was an extra, Richard saw men standing in the darkness, their eyes wide. Up the row a ways, General Meifert watched out on the night with the rest of them. Richard saw that it was false dawn, like the morning Kaelin had vanished. The woman he loved, the woman who everyone else had forgotten and didn't care to remember. If she had screamed, no one had heard her. And then, as the scream died, the world went blacker than black. It was like being plunged into the inky nothingness of the world of the dead, forlorn and forever lost. Richard shivered as his flesh felt like something alien touched the world of living with intimate promise. As quickly as the darkness had come, it was gone. Men looked around at one another, none speaking. The thought occurred to Richard that the viper now had only 3 heads. The keeper took one of his own, he explained to the questioning faces that had all turned to him. He saw the general watching, listening. Be glad that one so evil is no longer among the living. May all such people find the death they champion. Men smiled and whispered agreement with the curse as they began crawling back into their tents to try to snatch what was left of their sleep. General Meifert met Richard's gaze as he clapped a fist to his heart before vanishing back into his own tent. In the dim light of the camp that suddenly seemed to be populated only by tents and wagons, Richard spotted Nietzsche very deliberately heading straight for him. There was something profoundly disturbing about the way she looked. Perhaps it was that she had just vented a rage that he doubted anyone but he could truly understand or value. Flags of blonde hair flying, she reminded him of a raptor descending in on him from out of the night, all tight muscle and talons. When he saw the tears streaming down her face, her gritted teeth, her fury and hurt, her powerful menace and frail helplessness, her eyes filled with more than he could grasp, he stepped back into his tent, drawing her in out of the view of the camp. She swept into the tent right for him, like a storm breaking on a headland. He backed as far as he could, having no idea what was wrong or what she intended. With a sob of such naked desolation that it nearly made him cry out in kind, she fell to the ground at his feet, throwing her arms around his legs. She was clutching something in one hand. Richard realized that it was Kalen's white mother-confessor dress. "Oh, Richard, I'm so sorry," she wailed between racking gasps. "I'm so sorry for what I've done to you. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry," she kept mumbling over and over. He reached down and touched her shoulder. "Nietzsche, what is it?" "I'm so sorry," she cried as she clutched at his legs, as if she were the condemned begging a king for her life. "Oh, dear spirits, I'm so sorry for what I've done to you." He sank down, lifting her arms off his legs. "Nietzsche, what is it?" Her shoulders heaved with her racking sobs. She looked up at him as he lifted her by her arms. She was as limp as the dead. "Oh, Richard, I'm so sorry. I never believed you. I'm so sorry that I never believed you. I should have helped you, and instead I fought you every step. I'm so sorry." He had rarely seen anyone in such profound misery. "Nietzsche." "Please," she sobbed. "Please, Richard, end it now." "What?" "I don't want to live any more. It hurts too much. Please use your knife and end it. Please. I'm so sorry. I've done worse than simply not believe you. I've been the one who stopped you at every turn." She hung like a rag doll from his hands under her arms. She wept in utter misery and defeat. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. You were right about everything, and so much more. I'm so sorry. It's all ended now, and it's my fault. I'm so sorry. I should have believed you." She started to almost melt through his grip. Sitting on the floor in front of her, he gathered her up into his arms, much like he had gathered up Jillian. "Nietzsche, you were the only one who made me go on when I was ready to give up. You were the only one who made me fight." Nietzsche's arms came up around his neck when he pulled her close. She felt hot from the fever of her anguish. She sobbed and kept mumbling how sorry she was, how she should have believed in him about the rest of it, how it was all too late now, how she wanted to end the pain and die. Richard held her head to his shoulder as he whispered to her that it would be all right, whispered his comfort, rocked her gently and quieted her without saying anything of consequence except in its empathy. He remembered then when he had first met Kaylin, and they had spent that first night in a wayward pine. She had nearly been pulled back into the underworld, and he had drawn her back at the last moment. Kaylin had cried like this in abject terror and misery, but more than that, with the release of having someone hold her. Kaylin had never had anyone she valued hold her when she cried. He knew now that Nietzsche never had either. As he held her in his arms, giving her the unopposed comfort she so needed, she exhausted herself until, feeling safe as perhaps never before, she drifted into sleep. It was such a profound pleasure to be able to give her that rare refuge that he wept silently as he held her, and she slept, safe in his arms. He must have fallen asleep for a brief time, because when he opened his eyes, there was pale light coming through the walls of the summer tent. When he lifted his head, Nietzsche stirred in his arms like a child cuddling closer and never wanting to wake. But she did rather suddenly when she realized where she was. She looked up into his eyes, her blue eyes weary. "Richard," she whispered, in what he knew would be the beginning of the same thing. He pressed his fingertips to her lips, halting her words. "We have a lot of things to deal with. Tell me what you learned so that we can get on with it." She put the white dress in his hands. "You were right about almost everything, even if you didn't know the mechanism. Sister Ulysses and her small band wanted to remain free from the Dreamwalker, just as you said. They resolved, since you value life, to give you immortality. Anything else they did, no matter how destructive, they viewed as of secondary importance. This gave them the freedom to pursue freeing the Keeper." Richard's eyes went wider as he listened. "They found Chainfire, and used it to make everyone forget Kaylin, so that they could steal the boxes of Orden. Your father in the underworld let the Keeper know that you have memorized the book they need. They know that they need a confessor to obtain the truth. Kaylin accomplishes two tasks, stealing the boxes and helping to get the truth of the book you know. Chainfire, not the prophecy worm, is also responsible for what is happening to prophecy. The sisters have two of the boxes, and they put them in play. They have launched that phase of their plan for two reasons. Because they want to use Orden to call the Keeper into the world of life, and because the boxes of Orden were created as a counter to the power that can be engendered with Chainfire." Richard blinked. "What do you mean they only have two boxes? I thought they used Kaylin to steal all three. All three were in the Garden of Life." "Kaylin brought out one box. They gave it to Tovey and had her start out while they sent Kaylin back in for the other two." "Sent her back?" Richard frowned. "What are you leaving out?" Nietzsche licked her lips, but she didn't break his gaze. "The reason for Tovey's scream." Richard felt his eyes watering. A lump rose in his throat. Nietzsche laid a hand over his heart. "We'll get her back, Richard." He clenched his teeth and nodded. "So then what happened?" "The new Seeker surprised Tovey, stabbed her, and stole the box of Orden she was spiriting away from the People's Palace." "We have to start a search. They can't have gone far." "They are long gone, Richard. Just like they covered their tracks when they took Kaylin, they will have done the same this time. That is not the way to find them." Richard looked up. "Samuel. The sword of truth was a counter. When I gave him the sword, he must have recognized the truth about Kaylin." His gaze roved the inside of the tent as he tried to think. "We need to think this through, collect all the information we can, and get ahead of them instead of always being behind them." "I'll help you, Richard. Anything you want, I will do. I will help you get her back. She belongs with you, I know that now." He nodded, thankful that her iron was back. "I think we had better set some things straight and then get some experienced help." She smiled a crooked smile. "That's the Seeker I know." Outside the tent, men had begun to gather, all wanting to see the Lord Rahl. Out of the crowd came Verna. "Richard, Thank the Creator, our prayers have been answered. She threw her arms around him. Richard, how are you?
Where have you been?
I was tending to some injured men, scouts who met a few of the enemy. General Meifert sent word for me to return at once.
And the men?
Fine, she said with a smile. Now that you are finally with us for the final battle. He took up her hands.
Verna, you know you have had a hard time with me in the past.
She grinned as she nodded that it was true. When she saw that he wasn't smiling, her smile faded.
This is going to be one of those times, he told her. You are going to have to believe in me and what I say, or we might as well give up to the order right now.
Richard let go of her hand and climbed up on a crate to be better heard. He realized that a sea of men surrounded him. Kara and General Meifert were right near the front.
Lord Rahl, will you be able to lead us? He asked.
No, he called out into the still dawn air. Worried whispers spread back through the men. Richard held up his arms.
Listen to me, they quieted. I don't have much time. I don't have the time to explain things as I wish I could. That is the way it is. I will give you the facts, and I will let you decide. The army of the Imperial Order has been slowed a bit down south.
Richard held up his hands to stifle the cheers.
I don't have much time. Listen now. You men are the steel against steel. I am the magic against magic. I now must pick one of those two for the coming battle. If I stay here and lead you, fight with you, then we are not going to have much of a chance. The enemy forces are huge. I don't need to tell any of you men that much. If I stay and help you fight them, most of us will die. I can tell you right off, General Meifert said, that I don't like that choice.
Most of the men agreed that the grim picture he had just painted was not something they relished.
What's the alternative? A man nearby called out.
The alternative is that I let you men do your job and present the steel to keep the order from choosing instead to run rampant through our lands. Meanwhile, I pledge to do my job of being the magic against magic. I will do what only I can and work to find a way to defeat the enemy without any of you men having to lose your life in battle with them. I want to find a way with my power to banish or destroy them before we have to fight them. I can't guarantee that I will succeed. If I fail, I will die in the attempt, and you men will have to face the enemy.
Do you think you can stop them with magic of some sort? Another man asked.
Nietzsche jumped up beside him. Lord Rahl has already set people in the old world against Jagang's forces. We have fought battles in their own homeland in the hopes of taking away their support. If you insist on keeping Lord Rahl here with you, then you are wasting his singular talent, and you might die as a result. I ask, as one who fights at his side, that you let him be the Lord Rahl. Let him do as he must, while you do as you must.
I couldn't say it any better, Richard told them. There it is, then. That is the choice I give you.
Unexpectedly, men began going to their knees. Far and wide, dust rose as men shuffled to make space to kneel down. In one voice, the chant began.
Master Rahl, guide us. Master Rahl, teach us. Master Rahl, protect us. In your light we thrive. In your mercy we are sheltered. In your wisdom we are humbled. We live only to serve. Our lives are yours.
Richard watched out over the sea of men as the sun broke the horizon. The devotion was repeated a second time, and then a third time, as was customary in the field. Once it was done, men began to return to their feet.
I guess that's your answer, Lord Rahl, General Meifert said. Go get the bastards.
The men cheered their agreement. Richard hopped down and took Nietzsche's hand to help her down. She ignored the hand and jumped down of her own accord. Richard turned to Kara.
Well, I have to go. We're in a hurry.
Look, Kara, I want you to know that I would be fine with it if you would like to stay with the army. A dark frown descended over Kara as she folded her arms. "Are you crazy?" She looked up over her shoulder at the general. "I told you the man is crazy. See what I have to put up with?" General Meifert nodded seriously. "I don't know how you do it, Kara." "Training," she confided. She trailed her fingertips across his cheek, smiling up at him in a way Richard had never seen her do before. "Take care of yourself, General."
"Yes, ma'am."
He smiled at Nietzsche before bowing his head.
"As per your orders, Mistress Nietzsche."
Richard's mind was already elsewhere. "Come on, let's get going." Chapter 66. Marching down the frame and panel hall, Rika leading the way, Kara and Nietzsche in tow, Richard reached the intersection and turned down a stone passageway with a towering vaulted ceiling that soared up for nearly 200 feet. Fluted columns to the sides rose up at evenly spaced intervals. Through large windows at the top, the massive exterior buttresses that supported the lofty walls could be seen. Streamers of light angled in high overhead and from small round windows down lower. Their boot strikes echoed like hammers through the cold hall. Richard's cape that looked like it was made from spun gold billowed behind him as if in a gathering storm. The gold symbols around the black tunic fairly glowed in the muted light. Passing each shaft of sunlight, the silver emblems in his boots, on his wide multi-layered leather belt, and on his leather-padded wristbands sent blades of light flashing around them, announcing the arrival of a war wizard. The fury of any moored Sith was enough to cause most people's blood to pause in their veins, but cold anger on Kara's attractive features seemed capable of turning that stilled blood to ice. To his other side, the former Death's mistress in black looked no less formidable. From the first time he'd met her, Richard could almost hear the air around Nietzsche crackle with her power, and it was doing that now. Richard passed padded chairs and tables set in niches. Carpets at angles stuck partly into the hall in places, inviting people into quiet, cozy nooks. Richard skirted the carpets because the sound of his boots on polished granite suited him. None of those with him walked across the carpets either. With the reverberation coming back at them from the long hall, the sound built until it sounded like an invading army pouring through the keep. Rika turned to him without slowing. She gestured to the right. "They're in here, Lord Raoul." Richard cut the corner without slowing, aiming his march through the center of the huge double doors that stood open into the exquisite library. Heavy oak mullions, cross-hatched in the doors, divided them into a dozen glass panes each. There were shelves to the ceiling on the 30-foot back wall of the library, with ladders that rose on brass rails to provide access. Massive mahogany pillars stood gleaming in the streamers of sunlight coming in from high windows. But down low, the light was more gloomy and had to be cut with lamps. An enormous mahogany table with turned legs that were each bigger around than Richard sat opposite the doors. To each side, pillars rose to support vaults overhead. The ends of the room to the far left and right were left to the shadows. Anne looked astonished. "Richard, what are you doing here? You are supposed to be with our troops." Richard ignored her as he grasped the red leather book he had tucked under an arm. He used the book like a broom to sweep aside the sprawl of books laid before them, creating a broad, polished, empty spot before the three gifted people. Richard tossed the red leather-bound book on the table. It made a smacking sound that echoed almost like a clap of thunder. The gold lettering, Chainfire, gleamed in the gloom. "What's this?" Zed asked in dismay. "Proof," Richard said. "Part of it, anyway. I promised to bring back proof." "It's an ancient book," Nietzsche told them. "A formula for creating what is called a Chainfire event." Zed's hazel eyes turned up. "What is a Chainfire event?" "The end of the world as we know it," Richard said with grim finality. What they were doing turned out to inadvertently involve an attempt to create a contradiction, violating the 9th rule. They finally realized that if anyone ever actually undertook to initiate a Chainfire event, it would have cataclysmic consequences. Nathan frowned at Nietzsche, apparently hoping for a little more wisdom and experience from a former sister.
What is he talking about?
Wizards in ancient times came up with a new theory on how to alter memory with subtractive power, with all the resulting disconnected parts spontaneously reconstructed independently of one another, the creation of erroneous memory to fill in the voids that had been destroyed. They were studying the theory of how to make an individual disappear to everyone else by making people forget this person, even as soon as they've just seen them, even as they look at them. It unravels people's memory of the subject, but it was discovered that the ignition of such an event starts a cascade that can't be predicted or controlled. Much like a wildfire, it continues to burn through links with others whose memory has not been altered. It eventually unravels the world of life itself.
And the prophecy worm? Richard asked. It may be real, but the cause of the prophecy vanishing this time is Chainfire. As part of the process, the person who initiates the event also fills in a void in prophecy, a place left blank by a prophet for future work. This gap is filled in with a completing prophecy which has the Chainfire formula invested in it. A Chainfire event thus infects and consumes all the associated prophecy on the branch, starting with related prophecy, either in subject or in chronology, in this case both, Kaelin. Thus, she is also wiped out of prophecy by what is called the Chainfire corollary.
Nathan sat down heavily.
Dear spirits.
Anne, hands in her opposite sleeves, did not look pleased or impressed. All well and good, and we will have to study this book and see if anything you've come up with even begins to make sense. But that book is not the immediate problem. You should have stayed with our men. You must lead our troops in the final battle. You must return at once. Prophecy is quite clear. Prophecy says that if you fail to do this, the world will fall under the shadow. Richard ignored Anne and met his grandfather's gaze.
Guess what the counter is to a Chainfire event?
Zed shrugged, looking puzzled by Richard's line of questioning. How would I know?
There is only one. It was created specifically for this purpose.
What was? Zed asked.
The boxes of Orden.
Zed's mouth fell open. Richard, that just isn't... Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out what he had brought. He slammed it down on the table before the three of them. Zed's eyes went wide. Bags, Richard, that's a snake vine. You may recall from the Book of Counted Shadows, and when the 3 boxes of Orden are put into play, the snake vine shall grow. But, Zed stammered, the boxes of Orden are in the Garden of Life, in the People's Palace under incredibly heavy guard.
Not only that, Nathan put in, but I personally equipped the men of the first file with weapons that are deadly even against the gifted. No one could get in there.
I agree, Zed insisted. It's impossible. Richard turned and carefully took what Kara had been carrying. He gently set the statue of Spirit down so that the figure was facing the 3 on the other side of the table, as if she were holding her head high in opposition to their efforts to make her a delusion. This is Kaelin's. She left it there in the Garden of Life in place of the boxes so that someone would know she exists. The Chainfire spell erased her from everyone's memory. Those who see her forget her before she even registers in their minds. Anne waved a hand over the book, the vine, and the statue. But this is all still conjecture, Richard. Who in the world could even have dreamed up such a plot? Sister Ulyssia hatched the plan, Nietzsche said. She had Sisters Cecilia, Armina, and Tovy with her. Anne frowned. How do you know this? Tovy confessed it to me. Anne looked more than astonished.
Confessed? Why would she do such a thing? How did you even catch her?
She was fleeing with one of the boxes of Orden, Richard said. She was ambushed by the man I gave the Sword of Truth to. He stabbed her and stole the box of Orden she was carrying. Zed slapped his forehead, unable to speak, and thumped down into his chair.
Tovey also told me, Nietzsche said, that they were here in Aidendrill and planted that corpse in the Mother Confessor's grave to make sure no one believed Richard should he happen to try digging it up to convince people he was telling the truth. They got the dress out of the Confessor's palace. They wanted to make sure everyone thought Richard was deluded. Regarding that, I think you should also know that we traveled to the ruins of a city called Casca, down in southern Dahara. Imperial Order scouts were there. I conducted an experiment on one of them. I used the subtractive spell all of you wanted me to use to cure Richard of his supposed delusions.
Anne cautiously cocked her head.
And?
He didn't live more than a few moments. Zed, nearly as white now as his unruly hair, put his face in his hands.
I'm sure that some of this will prove quite useful, Anne said, looking rather confused. And it's good that you have uncovered it. But as I said, the fact remains that you need to be with our troops, Richard. We revealed to you that vitally important prophecy. If where Grisa Ost Drauka does not lead this final battle, then the world, already standing at the brink of darkness, will fall under that terrible shadow. These other matters you bring up are intriguing, to be sure, but the prophecy remains our most important mission. We simply can't fail, or the world will fall under the shadow.
Richard gripped his temples between his thumb and second finger as he looked down, trying to gather patience. He reminded himself that these people were trying to do what was right. He looked up, meeting their gazes. "Don't you see?" He pointed at the snake vine on the table. "This is the final battle. The Sisters of the Dark have put the boxes of Orden in play. They intend to bring the Keeper of the Dead into the world of the living. They intend to give life over to death in a bid to gain immortality for themselves. The world stands at the brink of darkness. Don't you see? If you three had had your way, bent on enforcing prophecy, and tried to live by words you believed to be foreordained, I would not have survived the attempt to cure me. I would be dead. In attempting to fulfill prophecy, you would have ensured the success of the Sisters of the Dark and the end of all life. The world of life would have ended because of you. Only free will, Nietzsche's free will, my free will, has prevented what you three would have brought upon mankind in following your blind faith in prophecy." Anne, the last one standing, dropped into her chair.
"Dear spirits, he's right," Zed whispered to himself. "The Seeker has just saved 3 old fools from themselves."
"No, none of you are fools," Richard said. "We all can do foolish things from time to time by not thinking. The thing to do then is to recognize a mistake and not repeat it. Learn from it. Don't allow yourself to fail the next time. I'm not here to tell you that you are fools, because I know you're not. I'm here because I need your help. I want you to start using your minds. You are all brilliant in your own way. You each have knowledge that probably no one else alive has. The woman I love, the woman I'm married to, has been kidnapped by Sisters of the Dark and had a Chainfire event unleashed on her life. That event is now burning through the lives of everyone who knew her and will eventually consume everyone living." He gestured to the statue of Spirit. "I carved that of your granddaughter's spirit, Zed. It was precious to her. She left it there on that stone altar, covered in her blood. I want her back. I need help. Neither Nietzsche nor Kara remembers Kaelin, but they both know the truth of the fact that they don't remember her because of what's in this book, Chainfire, not because she doesn't exist. You all lost something incredibly precious when your memory of Kaelin was taken from you. You lost a value in your lives that you could not begin to replace.
You lost one of the best.
Richard had to stop because he couldn't get the words past the constriction in his throat. Tears dripped from his face onto the table. Nietzsche came close and put a hand on his shoulder. "It will be all right, Richard. We'll get her back." Kara laid a hand on his other shoulder. "That's right, Lord Rahl. We'll get her back." Richard nodded, unable to speak, as his chin trembled. Zed rose up. "Richard, I hope you don't think we will fail you again. We won't. You have my word as first wizard."
"I'd rather have your word as my grandfather."
Zed smiled through his own tears.
"That too, my boy, that too."
Nathan shot to his feet.
"My sword's in play as well, my boy."
Anne scowled at him.
"Your sword is in play? What in the world does that mean?"
"Well, you know," Nathan said,
swirling his hand in a display of cut and thrust.
"It means I will fight the good fight."
"The good fight? How about if you help us find Kalen?"
"Well, bags, woman."
Anne shot a look at Zed.
"Did you teach him to talk like that? He never cursed like that before he spent time with you."
Zed shrugged innocently.
"My goodness, no, not me."
Anne scowled at the wizard on each side of her before looking at Richard and smiling.
"I remember when you were first born, Richard, when you were a bundle of life in your mother's arms. She was so proud of you then just for being able to cry. Well, I guess she'd be pretty proud of you now. We all are, Richard."
Zed wiped his nose on his sleeve.
"How true." "If you can forgive us," Anne said, "we'd like to be a part of stopping this threat. I, for one, am quite keen to take care of those sisters."
Nietzsche squeezed Richard's shoulder. "I think you may have a fight on your hands over that. I think we'd all like to be the one to get at them." Kara leaned past Richard. "Sure, easy for you to say. You got to kill Sister Tovi." Chapter 67. Richard stood at the crenellation in the rampart, one foot resting on the low stone, gazing out across the sunlit scene of Aidendrill down below the mountain, watching the puffy white clouds parade their shadows across the valley. Zed came up from behind and stood beside Richard, and for a time also watched out in silence.
"I can't remember Kalen," he finally said. "Try as I might, I just can't."
"I know," Richard answered, without looking over.
"But for her to be your wife, she must be a remarkable woman."
Richard couldn't help smiling. "She is that." Zed laid a bony hand on Richard's shoulder.
"We'll find her, my boy. I'm going to help you. We're going to find her, I promise you that."
Grinning, Richard put his arm around his grandfather's shoulders. "Thanks, Zed. I could surely use the help." Zed held up a finger.
"We'll get started right away."
"Right away would suit me," Richard told him. "I'm going to need to get me a sword, too."
"Ah, well, the sword isn't important. The sword is just a tool. The seeker is the weapon, and I'd say you are still the seeker."
"About that, Zed, you know, I've been thinking, and I've come to believe that maybe Shota wasn't acting selfishly by demanding the sword in exchange for what she told me."
"How do you figure that?"
"Well, the Sword of Truth draws from my gift. When I use my gift, such as that day we were down in the library, and I read from a book of prophecy, it has the very real potential to call the beast to me." Zed rubbed his smooth chin.
"Well, I guess that's true. Maybe in a way that did help to protect you."
He scowled at Richard.
"But she gave it to Samuel. He's a thief."
"And what did he steal since he got the sword back?" Zed peered at Richard with one eye.
"Steal? I don't know. What do you mean?"
"He near to killed a sister of the dark and took the box of Orden she had, preventing the sisters from having all three, so that they can invoke the magic of Orden. Zed's scowl deepened. And just what do you suppose that little thief is going to do with the box? Richard shrugged. I don't know, but at least he bought us some time. We can go after him now and prevent the sisters from having all 3 boxes at least. Zed scratched the hollow of his cheek as he gave Richard a sidelong glance. Kind of reminds a fellow of the last time, doesn't it? With Dark and Rahl having to get the last box. Richard frowned over at his grandfather. What are you saying? Zed shrugged. Nothing, I'm just saying. Saying what? Like I said, kind of reminds one of the last time, that's all. Zed clapped Richard on the shoulder. Well, come on. Rika has dinner ready. We'll all get a good meal before we lay out some ideas for how to proceed. That sounds great to me. How do you know? I haven't even told you what she's cooking. No, I mean... Never mind. Let's go. End of Chainfire, The Sword of Truth, Book 9, by Terry Goodkind.